The cupboard under the stairs at number 4 Privet Drive had never been meant for human habitation. But then again, the Dursleys had never considered Harry Potter to be particularly human. 7 years old and small for his age, Harry huddled in the cramped darkness, his knees drawn up to his chest as he tried to make himself as invisible as possible. The wooden slats of the staircase above creaked ominously with each heavy footfall from his Uncle Vernon, who paced the hallway like a caged beast seeking its next victim. The purple petunias had been an accident. Harry knew this with the desperate certainty of a child who had spent his entire conscious life walking on eggshells around the Dursley family's volcanic tempers. He had simply been weeding the front garden as instructed, pulling up the unwanted plants that Aunt Petunia despised with almost religious fervour, when something had gone terribly wrong. One moment he was yanking at a particularly stubborn dandelion. The next moment every single one of his aunt's prized white petunias had transformed into a vivid shade of royal purple. The transformation had been instantaneous and complete. Not a gradual shift that might have been explained away as some sort of plant disease or trick of the afternoon light, but a sudden burst of impossible colour that had left Harry staring in horrified fascination. For just one brief moment, he had felt something warm and electric coursing through his small body, like lightning trapped beneath his skin seeking release. Then Aunt Petunia's shriek had shattered the silence, and Harry's world had collapsed into the familiar chaos of accusations, threats, and inevitable punishment. Uncle Vernon's voice boomed through the house, each word dripping with the kind of rage that made Harry's stomach clench with anticipatory dread. "Freak! Unnatural little freak! After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us, making our home into some sort of circus sideshow for the neighbours to gawk at." Harry pressed his face against his knees and tried to disappear entirely. The cupboard smelled of dust and cleaning supplies, mothballs and the lingering scent of old shoes. It was barely large enough for him to lie down in, and the single bare bulb that served as his only source of light had burned out weeks ago. The Dursleys had not bothered to replace it. Through the thin door, he could hear his cousin Dudley's excited babbling as he recounted the afternoon's events to anyone who would listen. "It was brilliant, Dad. 1 second the flowers were normal, and then wham! Purple as anything." And Harry just stood there looking all scared and weird like he always does. "That boy," Aunt Petunia's voice was sharp with disgust, and something that might have been fear, "is becoming more like them every day. I won't have it, Vernon. I simply won't have that sort of unnaturalness in my home." The them she referred to needed no clarification. Harry had learned years ago that any reference to his parents was forbidden in the Dursley household, spoken of only in hushed, hateful whispers when they thought he couldn't hear. His parents had been freaks, according to his relatives, dangerous people who had gotten themselves killed in a car crash and left their equally dangerous offspring on the Dursleys' doorstep like some sort of unwanted package. But Harry remembered things the Dursleys didn't know he remembered. Fragments of green light and screaming, the sound of splintering wood and his mother's voice calling his name with desperate love. He remembered feeling safe and warm and wanted, emotions so foreign to his current existence that they felt like stories from someone else's life. Uncle Vernon's footsteps stopped directly outside the cupboard door, and Harry's entire body tensed in preparation for what was to come. His uncle's voice, when it came, was deceptively quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded the worst punishments, the ones that left marks hidden beneath Harry's too large hand-me-down clothes. "Open this door, boy." Harry's small hands trembled as he reached for the door handle. He had learned that hesitation only made things worse. The door swung open to reveal Uncle Vernon's massive frame, blocking out the hallway light, his face purple with rage and his small eyes glittering with malicious intent. "Come out here." Harry crawled out of the cupboard on hands and knees, his movements careful and submissive. He kept his eyes fixed on the worn carpet, not daring to meet his uncle's gaze. Experience had taught him that direct eye contact was interpreted as defiance, and defiance was always punished. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." The contradiction was intentional, Harry knew. No matter what he did, it would be wrong. He slowly raised his green eyes to meet his uncle's furious stare, watching as Vernon's face seemed to swell with renewed anger. "Explain to me, boy, how my wife's prize-winning petunias turned purple. Explain to me how something like that could possibly be natural or normal, or anything that a decent, God-fearing family should have to deal with in their own home." Harry opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. There was no explanation that would satisfy Uncle Vernon. There never was. The truth was impossible, and lies would only make the punishment worse. "I don't know," Harry whispered, his voice barely audible. "You don't know." Vernon's voice was flat and dangerous. 7 years old, and you expect me to believe that you have no idea how my garden was vandalized by some sort of impossible nonsense? "It wasn't vandalism," Harry said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I was weeding like Aunt Petunia asked, and something just happened. I didn't mean for it to happen." The backhanded slap came so quickly that Harry didn't see it coming. The force of it sent him sprawling across the hallway floor, his cheek burning and his ear ringing. Stars exploded across his vision as his head struck the baseboard with a sickening thud. "Don't you dare try to make excuses for your freakishness," Vernon snarled, looming over Harry's crumpled form. "I've had 7 years of your accidents and your strangeness and your unnatural behavior, and I'm sick to death of it. You want to know what I think happened to your freak parents? I think they got exactly what they deserved for being abnormal, and if you keep going down the same path, you're going to end up just like them." Harry tasted blood in his mouth, where he had bitten his tongue during the fall. He struggled to sit up, his small body aching from the impact, but Vernon's massive hand clamped down on his shoulder and shoved him back down. "I'm talking," Vernon roared. "You stay right there and listen to what I have to say. This family has given you everything: food, shelter, clothes, a roof over your ungrateful head. And this is how you repay us? By embarrassing us in front of the entire neighborhood with your freakish displays." Aunt Petunia appeared in the doorway behind her husband, her thin face pinched with disgust as she looked down at Harry. "The neighbors are already talking, Vernon. Mrs. Number 7 asked me 3 times if we were planning some sort of garden party with decorative flowers. I had to lie and say it was a new variety we were testing." "Lies," Vernon spat. "Always having to tell lies to cover up for this boy's abnormality. Well, no more. I'm done making excuses. I'm done pretending that there's anything normal about him." Harry's vision swam as he tried to focus on his uncle's face. The ringing in his ear was getting worse, and he could feel something warm and sticky running down the side of his neck where his head had struck the wall. But it was the look in Vernon's eyes that truly terrified him. It was the look of a man who had reached the end of his patience and was ready to do something permanent about his problem. "Please," Harry whispered, hating himself for begging but unable to stop the words from spilling out. "I'm sorry. I'll be good. I won't do anything strange anymore." "You're right about that," Vernon said with cold satisfaction, "because I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what happens to freaks who forget their place in this family." Vernon's hand closed around Harry's thin wrist with bruising force, hauling him to his feet, despite Harry's stumbling attempts to find his balance. The world tilted sickeningly, and Harry had to swallow hard to keep from vomiting as his uncle dragged him toward the kitchen. "Vernon," Aunt Petunia said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was unusual for her. "Perhaps we should just send him to his cupboard without supper again. The neighbors might hear if—" "The neighbors can mind their own business," Vernon snapped. "This boy needs to learn that actions have consequences, and I'm going to teach him that lesson once and for all." The kitchen was Aunt Petunia's domain, immaculately clean and organized with the obsessive attention to detail that she brought to every aspect of her life. The late afternoon sun streamed through the pristine windows, casting cheerful patterns on the floor that seemed to mock the darkness of the situation unfolding within the room's walls. Vernon released Harry's wrist with enough force to send the boy stumbling against the kitchen counter. The edge caught Harry in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs in a painful whoosh. He gasped and doubled over, trying to catch his breath, while his uncle opened the utility drawer with deliberate slowness. 7 years, Vernon said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather instead of selecting an implement of punishment. 7 years of putting up with your strangeness, your accidents, your unnatural behavior. 7 years of neighbors asking questions and making comments and wondering why everything around you seems to go wrong. Harry's eyes widened in horror as his uncle's hand closed around the wooden spoon that Aunt Petunia used for her cooking. It was heavy and solid, designed for stirring large pots and mixing thick batters. In Vernon's massive fist, it looked more like a weapon than a kitchen utensil. "This ends tonight," Vernon continued, testing the weight of the spoon in his hand. "No more accidents. No more strangeness. No more embarrassing this family with your freakish displays. By the time I'm done with you, you'll think twice before doing anything that might be considered abnormal." Harry backed away until he felt the refrigerator against his spine. There was nowhere else to go. The kitchen suddenly felt enormous and claustrophobic at the same time, a trap closing around him with no hope of escape. "Please don't," Harry whispered, his green eyes enormous in his pale face. "I promise I'll be normal. I promise I won't make any more accidents happen." "Too late for promises," Vernon said, with grim satisfaction. "Should have thought about that before you decided to turn my wife's flowers into some sort of carnival attraction." The first blow caught Harry across the shoulders, sending him to his knees on the cold linoleum floor. The wooden spoon struck with the force of Vernon's considerable strength behind it, and Harry cried out despite his efforts to remain silent. He had learned long ago that making noise during punishment only made Vernon angrier. "This is what happens to freaks!" Vernon panted, raising the spoon again. "This is what happens to boys who forget that they're nothing but a burden on decent families." The second blow landed across Harry's back, and the third across his thin arms as he tried desperately to protect himself. Each strike felt like fire against his skin, and Harry could feel tears streaming down his face despite his attempts to be brave. "Stop!" he gasped. "Please, Uncle Vernon, I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix purple flowers," Vernon roared. "Sorry doesn't explain 7 years of accidents and strangeness and embarrassment." Aunt Petunia stood in the doorway, watching with an expression of cold satisfaction. Dudley peeked around her, his small, pig-like eyes bright with excitement at seeing his cousin finally getting what he had always insisted Harry deserved. The beating continued until Vernon's arm grew tired and Harry had curled into a small ball on the kitchen floor, sobbing quietly into his hands. Every part of his body ached, and he could feel warm blood seeping through his thin shirt where the wooden spoon had broken the skin. "Get up," Vernon commanded, slightly out of breath from his exertions. Harry tried to obey, but his legs wouldn't support his weight. He collapsed back to the floor, trembling with pain and shock and the terrible certainty that this was only the beginning. "I said get up. I can't," Harry whispered. Vernon's face darkened further, and for a moment, Harry thought his uncle might actually kick him while he was down. Instead, Vernon grabbed a fistful of Harry's dark hair and hauled him upright, ignoring the boy's cry of pain. "You will go to your cupboard," Vernon said with deadly quiet. "You will not come out until tomorrow evening. No food, no water, no bathroom breaks. And if I hear so much as a peep out of you, this beating will seem like a gentle pat on the head compared to what happens next." Harry nodded frantically, desperate to agree to anything that would end the immediate threat. Vernon released his grip on Harry's hair and shoved him toward the hallway, where the cupboard door stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. "And boy," Vernon called after him, his voice carrying the promise of future violence, "if anything else strange happens around this house, anything at all, I'll beat you until you wish you'd never been born. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Uncle Vernon," Harry whispered. "I can't hear you." "Yes, Uncle Vernon," Harry said louder, his voice cracking with pain and fear. "Good. Now get out of my sight." Harry crawled into the cupboard and curled up in the farthest corner, as small as he could make himself. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that made his heart sink. The lock clicked into place, followed by the sound of Vernon's heavy footsteps moving away. Alone in the darkness, Harry allowed himself to cry properly for the first time. The sobs came in great, gasping waves that shook his small frame and made his injuries ache even more. Everything hurt. His back, his shoulders, his arms, his head where it had struck the wall. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing weight of despair that settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He was trapped, completely and utterly trapped, with no hope of escape or rescue. The Dursleys could do anything they wanted to him, and no one would ever know or care. He was alone in the world, unwanted and unloved, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Hours passed in the cramped darkness. Harry could hear the family moving around above him, the sounds of dinner being prepared and eaten, television programs playing, normal family life continuing as if nothing had happened, as if a 7-year-old boy wasn't locked in a cupboard, bleeding and crying just a few feet away. Dudley's friends came over for the evening, their loud voices and running footsteps creating a constant thundering above Harry's head. At one point, Dudley deliberately jumped on the stairs directly over the cupboard, laughing as each impact made Harry flinch and curl tighter into his corner. "Having fun in there, freak?" Dudley called through the door. "Dad says you're not coming out until tomorrow night. I hope you get really, really hungry and thirsty and scared." Harry bit his lip to keep from responding. Any sound he made would be reported to Uncle Vernon, and he couldn't survive another beating so soon after the first one. As the night wore on and the house gradually grew quiet, Harry found himself slipping into a strange, disconnected state, somewhere between waking and sleeping. His body ached constantly, a throbbing reminder of his uncle's anger, but his mind began to drift away from the immediate pain toward something else entirely. He thought about the petunias, about the moment when he had felt that strange warmth flowing through his body. It had felt powerful and wild and completely beyond his control, but it had also felt right somehow, natural, despite what the Dursleys claimed, as if something inside him was trying to break free and show the world what it was capable of. The thought terrified him. If Uncle Vernon's reaction to purple flowers had been this violent, what would happen if something even stranger occurred? What would happen if Harry couldn't control whatever was happening to him? But beneath the fear was something else, something that Harry barely dared to acknowledge even to himself. For just that one moment, when the petunias had transformed in a burst of impossible color, he had felt powerful. Not weak and helpless and at the mercy of people who hated him, but strong, special, like he was meant for something more than being the Dursleys' unwanted burden. The contradiction was almost more than his 7-year-old mind could process. How could something that felt so right be so wrong? How could something that made him feel powerful and special also be the cause of so much pain and punishment? As the hours crawled by and exhaustion began to take hold, despite the discomfort of his position, Harry found himself whispering desperate prayers to anyone who might be listening. Please let someone help him. Please let someone care that he was trapped and hurt and afraid. Please let there be somewhere else he could go. Somewhere he would be wanted and safe and loved. But no help came. No rescue appeared. The house remained silent, except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of Uncle Vernon's snoring. Harry was alone with his pain and his fear and the growing certainty that this was how his life would always be. He must have dozed fitfully, because the next thing he knew was a sharp sound that jerked him back to consciousness. At first, he thought it might be Uncle Vernon coming to deliver another beating, but the noise hadn't come from the hallway. It had come from inside the cupboard itself. Harry held his breath and listened. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then he heard it again, a soft scratching sound, like claws against wood. His first thought was rats, which would be just another misery to add to his collection. but something about the rhythm of the scratching suggested intelligence rather than random rodent activity. Then he felt it, that same warm electric sensation that had preceded the Petunia incident, but stronger this time, much stronger. It started in his chest and spread outward through his arms and legs, making his skin tingle and his hair stand on end. Every nerve in his body seemed to come alive with energy that had nowhere to go. Harry pressed himself against the wall of the cupboard, terrified of what was happening to him. The sensation was building, growing more intense by the second, and he could feel his control slipping away like sand through his fingers. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to make it stop, tried to push the strange energy back down where it couldn't cause any more trouble. But it was too late. The power inside him had reached a critical point, and there was no containing it anymore. The transformation began in his fingertips. Harry felt his hands growing smaller, his fingers shortening and curving into something that was definitely not human. Panic flooded through him as he stared at his hands in the darkness, watching them reshape themselves into something alien and terrifying. The changes spread up his arms with relentless efficiency. His skin began to sprout feathers, soft and white and completely impossible. His bones shifted and realigned themselves, becoming lighter and more delicate, even as his muscles reconfigured to serve an entirely different purpose. Harry tried to scream, but the sound that emerged from his throat was not human. It was a high, piercing cry that belonged to something that had never walked on two legs, or lived in a house, or worried about purple petunias. The transformation accelerated, washing over his entire body like a tide of change that could not be stopped or reversed. His face elongated into a curved beak, his ears disappeared entirely, and his eyes repositioned themselves to provide a completely different field of vision. His legs shortened and became covered in thick, powerful talons designed for gripping and tearing. Within moments, Harry Potter, the 7-year-old boy, had completely ceased to exist. In his place was a snowy owl, small and confused and absolutely terrified by what had just happened. The owl that had been Harry flapped its wings frantically in the confined space of the cupboard, desperate to escape the wooden prison that had suddenly become even more claustrophobic. Its keen senses detected the faint current of air coming from the cupboard's ventilation grate, and instinct took over where conscious thought had failed. With desperate strength, born of pure survival instinct, the owl launched itself at the grate, its sharp talons finding purchase on the metal slats. The grate was old and corroded, held in place by screws that had loosened over the years. Under the owl's determined assault, it gave way with a soft screech of protesting metal. Freedom beckoned through the opening, and the owl that had been Harry Potter squeezed through the gap and into the space between the walls of No. 4 Privet Drive. From there, it was a short, claustrophobic journey to the outside wall of the house, where another grate provided access to the cool night air. The owl burst from the house like a white ghost, its wings catching the faint breeze as it soared over the perfectly manicured lawns and identical houses of Privet Drive. For the first time in his 7 years of life, Harry Potter was truly free. But freedom, he was about to discover, came with its own set of terrifying challenges. Because somewhere far below, a small boy's consciousness was trapped inside the body of a creature that operated on entirely different instincts, and he had absolutely no idea how to get back to being human again. The Great Hall of the Ministry of Magic had never witnessed a scene quite like the one that unfolded on the crisp autumn morning when Harry Potter, accompanied by his most trusted allies, arrived to present evidence that would forever change the wizarding world's understanding of justice and corruption. The massive chamber, with its peacock blue ceiling and golden fountain, seemed to hold its breath as 3 figures moved through the assembled crowd of reporters, ministry officials, and curious onlookers who had gathered in response to carefully leaked information about an announcement that promised to expose scandals reaching the highest levels of magical government. Harry's appearance drew gasps of recognition and speculation from the assembled crowd, but the boy who walked confidently beside Professor Babbling and Remus Lupin bore little resemblance to the traumatized child who had vanished from Privet Drive months earlier. His transformation was evident, not only in his obvious magical development, but in the poise and determination that marked every step as he approached the speaker's platform, where ministry officials waited with expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly concealed alarm. The weeks following Peter Pettigrew's capture had been spent in careful preparation for this moment, building coalitions and gathering support from every corner of the magical community that shared their commitment to justice and reform. The evidence they carried represented not only proof of Sirius Black's innocence, but documentation of systematic corruption that extended throughout multiple branches of magical government and society. Minister Cornelius Fudge's attempts to control the proceedings and limit the scope of their revelations were doomed from the moment Harry began speaking. The boy's voice carried magical resonance that commanded attention and respect in ways that political authority could never match, and his words painted pictures of injustice and manipulation that made denial or deflection impossible for even the most skilled political operatives. The presentation of evidence began with Peter Pettigrew himself, magically compelled to repeat his confession before the assembled crowd in terms that left no room for misinterpretation or doubt. His testimony revealed not only the specific details of his betrayal of James and Lily Potter, but also the broader network of corruption and conspiracy that had enabled his crimes while allowing an innocent man to suffer imprisonment for acts he had never committed. But the most shocking revelations came when Harry began describing the systematic manipulation and educational neglect that had characterized his own placement with the Dursleys, backed by documentation that Professor Babbling had gathered through months of careful research. The evidence painted a picture of deliberate abuse and isolation designed to prevent Harry from developing the magical knowledge and social connections that might allow him to question the official narrative about his parents' deaths and his own supposed destiny. Dumbledore's presence in the Great Hall added dramatic weight to the proceedings, as the man widely regarded as the leader of the Light found himself confronted with evidence of decisions and policies that revealed the true cost of his strategic planning. Harry's description of the blood wards that supposedly protected him at Privet Drive, but which had actually been designed to suppress his magical development and prevent him from discovering the truth about his condition, created a moment of stunned silence that seemed to stretch throughout the entire chamber. The revelation of the Horcrux that had been embedded in Harry's scar without his knowledge or consent brought gasps of horror and outrage from the assembled crowd. Professor Babbling's scholarly explanation of soul magic and its effects on developing magical cores made it clear that Harry had been carrying part of Voldemort's soul throughout his childhood, creating magical instabilities and psychological pressures that had contributed to his transformation and years of suffering. More damning still was the evidence that Dumbledore had known about the Horcrux from the beginning, but had chosen to conceal this information while allowing Harry to suffer the consequences of magical contamination without proper treatment or support. The pattern of manipulation and sacrifice of individual welfare for supposed strategic advantage was becoming undeniably clear as more documentation was presented to the increasingly horrified audience. Harry's account of his transformation and subsequent development outside institutional control challenged fundamental assumptions about magical education and the rights of young practitioners to determine their own futures. His demonstration of abilities that transcended normal categories while maintaining clear moral principles and emotional stability proved that alternative approaches to magical development could produce remarkable results when supported by genuine care and respect for individual autonomy. The political implications of these revelations extended far beyond questions of individual justice to encompass broader issues of governmental accountability and the protection of vulnerable members of magical society. The corruption that had enabled Sirius Black's false imprisonment and Harry's abuse represented systemic failures that demanded comprehensive reform rather than simple punishment of individual wrongdoers. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, emerged as one of the few ministry officials whose integrity and competence had not been compromised by the corrupting influences that Harry's evidence exposed. Her immediate response to the presented documentation demonstrated the kind of principled leadership that had been notably absent from other areas of magical government, and her commitment to pursuing justice regardless of political consequences provided hope that meaningful reform might actually be achievable. The legal proceedings that followed Harry's presentation moved with unprecedented speed and thoroughness, as Amelia Bones deployed her department's resources to verify every aspect of the evidence that had been presented, while ensuring that proper procedures were followed to prevent any challenges to the validity of their findings. The magical techniques used to authenticate Peter Pettigrew's confession and the supporting documentation represented the most sophisticated forensic magic that the ministry had ever employed in a single case. Sirius Black's release from Azkaban occurred within hours of the formal verification of his innocence, marking the end of 12 years of wrongful imprisonment and the beginning of a new phase in Harry's life that would be defined by family connection and genuine support rather than isolation and manipulation. The reunion between Godfather and Godson took place in the ministry's secure holding areas, away from the media attention and political drama that surrounded the broader implications of the case. The emotional weight of finally meeting his father's best friend and his own legal guardian was almost overwhelming for Harry, representing the fulfillment of dreams he had barely dared to acknowledge during his months of healing and development. But the relationship that began in those first moments of reunion was built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice rather than simple familial obligation, creating a foundation for genuine partnership rather than paternalistic protection. Sirius's own transformation during his years of imprisonment had created parallels with Harry's experience that fostered immediate understanding and connection between them. Both had been forced to develop beyond normal human limitations in order to survive circumstances that would have broken lesser individuals, and both had emerged from their ordeals with enhanced capabilities and deepened appreciation for freedom and autonomy. The magical bond that formed between Harry and Sirius during their reunion was unlike anything Professor Babbling had documented in her extensive research into family magic and protective enchantments. The connection transcended normal familial relationships to create something that approached the enhanced familiar bonds that Harry shared with Hedwig, suggesting that their shared experiences of transformation and resistance had created possibilities for magical partnership that conventional family magic could never achieve. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Sirius's release was the validation it provided for Harry's decision to resist institutional control and pursue alternative approaches to his magical development and personal healing. The man who emerged from Azkaban had maintained his sanity and moral principles through methods that bore striking similarities to the techniques that Harry had developed during his own transformation, confirming that unconventional approaches to magical practice could succeed where traditional methods had failed. The public exposure of Dumbledore's manipulation and the systematic failures that had characterized Harry's upbringing created political pressures that extended far beyond simple accountability for past mistakes. Reform movements throughout magical society began demanding comprehensive changes to educational policies, child protection procedures, and governmental oversight mechanisms that would prevent similar injustices from occurring in the future. Harry's role in these broader reform efforts evolved naturally from his position as both victim of systematic abuse and successful practitioner of alternative magical development. His unique perspective and demonstrated capabilities gave him credibility with constituencies that conventional political figures could never reach, while his commitment to principles rather than personal advancement provided moral authority that transcended normal political considerations. The opposition to these reform efforts was immediate and intense, as entrenched interests throughout magical society recognized the threat that genuine accountability and transparency would pose to their positions and privileges. The forces that had enabled corruption and abuse would not surrender their power without a fight, and Harry's emergence as a symbol of resistance and alternative possibilities made him a target for those who sought to preserve existing systems regardless of their human cost. Hedwig's evolution throughout these political developments demonstrated the continuing growth of their remarkable partnership and the ways in which their bond transcended normal categories of magical relationship. Her intelligence and magical capabilities had reached levels that allowed her to participate directly in strategic planning and tactical operations, creating a form of distributed consciousness that multiplied their effective capabilities far beyond what individual practitioners could normally achieve. More importantly, Hedwig's perspective on the political conflicts that surrounded them provided emotional stability and moral clarity that prevented Harry from being corrupted by the power and influence that his unique position had created. Her owl consciousness offered balance and perspective that complemented human moral complexity, while maintaining focus on practical outcomes and genuine welfare rather than abstract principles or political advantage. The magical techniques that Harry had developed during his months of transformation and healing proved invaluable in navigating the complex challenges of public exposure and political conflict. His dual nature provided advantages in both strategic thinking and tactical execution that conventional practitioners could never match, while his enhanced perceptual abilities allowed him to detect deception and manipulation in ways that made him nearly immune to the kinds of political maneuvering that had victimized him in the past. But perhaps the most significant advantage that Harry possessed was the moral clarity and emotional stability that his healing process had provided. The boy who had once been powerless to defend himself against his uncle's rage had become someone capable of wielding significant power and influence while maintaining clear principles and genuine concern for others who had been victimized by similar systems of oppression and control. The magical education that Professor Babbling had provided throughout Harry's development had prepared him not only for the technical challenges of advanced magical practice, but also for the ethical complexities of using power responsibly in service of justice and social progress. Her scholarly approach to magical theory had been combined with practical wisdom about human nature and political realities that equipped Harry to navigate conflicts that would have overwhelmed less prepared practitioners. The coalition that formed around Harry's campaign for justice and reform represented something unprecedented in magical politics, a partnership between principled practitioners from diverse backgrounds who shared commitment to human dignity and individual autonomy rather than institutional power or ideological purity. The effectiveness of their collaboration demonstrated possibilities for positive change that extended far beyond the immediate questions of Sirius's innocence and Harry's personal freedom. The resistance they faced from entrenched interests and corrupt officials only strengthened their resolve and clarified the stakes involved in their struggle for reform and accountability. The forces that opposed them represented everything that Harry had escaped when he fled Privet Drive: the willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for supposed greater good, the assumption that some people were expendable in pursuit of political objectives, and the belief that power justified any means necessary to maintain control. But Harry's allies represented something different: the possibility that magical society could evolve beyond the patterns of manipulation and exploitation that had characterized its development for centuries. Their success in exposing corruption and achieving justice for Sirius demonstrated that principled resistance could produce concrete results when supported by careful planning, genuine cooperation, and unwavering commitment to shared values. The magical protections that surrounded Harry and his allies during this period of intense public exposure and political conflict demonstrated the advantages of operating outside conventional institutional frameworks while maintaining clear ethical principles. The techniques they employed for security and communication drew on multiple magical traditions while incorporating innovations that reflected their unique circumstances and unconventional partnerships. As the immediate crisis of Sirius's exoneration gave way to the longer-term challenges of systematic reform and continued resistance to entrenched corruption, Harry found himself facing choices about his future role and responsibilities that would determine not only his personal development, but the trajectory of magical society's evolution toward greater justice and accountability. The boy who had once been locked in a cupboard had become a catalyst for changes that would influence magical politics and social development for generations to come. His transformation from powerless victim to effective agent of reform had proven that individual courage and principled resistance could challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression and control. But perhaps most importantly, Harry's journey had demonstrated that healing and empowerment were not individual achievements, but collective processes that required genuine community and shared commitment to values that transcended personal interest. The allies who had supported his development and independence had created something that extended far beyond simple political coalition to encompass the kind of chosen family and authentic partnership that made sustained resistance and positive change possible. The great hall that had witnessed the exposure of corruption and the beginning of meaningful reform would continue to serve as a symbol of the possibility that institutional change could occur when principled individuals chose to resist rather than accept injustice as inevitable. The proceedings that had begun with Harry's simple desire to free an innocent man had evolved into something that promised to reshape the fundamental relationships between power and accountability in magical society. As the formal ceremonies concluded, and the immediate political drama gave way to the patient work of implementing actual reform, Harry understood that his transformation was entering yet another phase that would require different skills and face different challenges than those that had brought him to this moment of triumph and recognition. The renovated halls of Grimmauld Place bore little resemblance to the grim ancestral home that Sirius Black had inherited from his family's dark legacy. 6 months had passed since his exoneration and release from Azkaban. 6 months of intensive magical cleaning and restoration that had transformed the ancient townhouse into something that could serve as both sanctuary and headquarters for the remarkable family that had formed around Harry's unprecedented journey from victim to catalyst for change. The house itself seemed to breathe with new life as Harry moved through rooms that had been purged of dark artifacts and malevolent enchantments, replaced with protective wards and healing magic that reflected the values and priorities of its current inhabitants. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been sealed for decades, illuminating walls that displayed portraits of magical creatures and landscapes rather than the stern faces of Black family ancestors who had embraced the darkest aspects of wizarding tradition. But perhaps the most significant transformation was evident in Sirius himself, whose recovery from 12 years of wrongful imprisonment had been accelerated and enhanced by the same healing techniques that Professor Babbling had developed during Harry's therapeutic treatment. The hollow-eyed fugitive who had emerged from Azkaban had evolved into someone who combined the best qualities of his younger self with wisdom and determination that reflected his extraordinary experiences and survival. The magical bond that had formed between Harry and Sirius during their reunion continued to strengthen and develop in ways that challenged conventional understanding of family magic and protective enchantments. Their connection operated on levels that transcended normal familial relationships, creating a form of distributed consciousness and shared magical capability that resembled the enhanced familiar bonds that Harry maintained with Hedwig while retaining distinctly human characteristics. This morning's gathering in the renovated library represented a milestone in their collective journey toward healing and empowerment, as Harry prepared to make decisions about his future education and development that would determine not only his personal trajectory, but the broader implications of his unique magical abilities and social position. The choices before him reflected possibilities that had seemed impossible during his months of desperate survival and gradual recovery. Professor Babbling's presence at this family council demonstrated the evolution of her role from scholarly mentor to something approaching a grandmother figure whose guidance and support had become integral to their collective well-being. Her research into alternative magical education had expanded beyond Harry's individual needs to encompass broader questions about how the wizarding world could better serve young practitioners whose abilities and circumstances defied conventional categories. The proposal that emerged from months of careful planning and consultation represented something unprecedented in magical education, a completely independent academy designed to serve students whose needs could not be met by existing institutional frameworks. The school would combine rigorous academic standards with respect for individual autonomy and alternative approaches to magical development, creating an environment where unconventional practitioners could thrive rather than simply survive. Harry's central role in this educational experiment reflected both his unique qualifications and his commitment to ensuring that other magical children would not suffer the isolation and neglect that had characterized his own early development. His experiences had given him insights into the challenges faced by young practitioners who existed outside normal social and magical categories, while his demonstrated abilities provided credibility that could attract resources and support from progressive elements throughout the magical community. But the decision to establish an alternative academy also represented a conscious choice to remain outside conventional wizarding society rather than seeking accommodation within existing institutions. This path offered tremendous freedom and possibility for innovative approaches to magical education, but it also meant accepting continued responsibility for challenging and potentially reforming systems that had proven resistant to change from within. Remus Lupin's contribution to these discussions reflected his own evolution from solitary survivor to active participant in positive social change. His experience with marginalization and discrimination had given him understanding of the challenges that unconventional practitioners faced, while his academic background and teaching abilities provided practical knowledge about curriculum development and educational methodology. More importantly, Remus's presence in their family unit had created stability and emotional support that allowed both Harry and Sirius to heal from their respective traumas while building healthy relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than simple obligation or convenience. His relationship with Sirius had evolved beyond their original friendship to encompass partnership and commitment that provided foundation for genuine family life. The magical techniques that Harry had mastered during his months of transformation and development would serve as core curriculum elements for the proposed academy, offering students opportunities to explore alternative approaches to magical practice that emphasized harmony between conscious intent and natural magical forces. His dual nature provided unique insights into the integration of different forms of consciousness and capability that could benefit any practitioner seeking to develop beyond conventional limitations. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the educational philosophy that emerged from their planning was its emphasis on ethical development and social responsibility, alongside technical magical training. Harry's experiences had demonstrated that power without moral foundation could become corrupted by isolation and resentment, while principled resistance supported by genuine community could achieve remarkable results in promoting justice and positive change. The students who would be served by their academy would include not only magical children whose abilities defied normal categories, but also young practitioners from families and backgrounds that had been marginalized or excluded by existing magical institutions. Muggle-born students whose parents could not navigate wizarding society, children from magical creature families who faced discrimination, and practitioners whose magical abilities manifested in unconventional ways would all find welcome and support in an environment designed to celebrate diversity rather than demand conformity. Hedwig's role in these educational plans reflected the continuing evolution of her remarkable partnership with Harry and the ways in which their bond had created possibilities for magical practice that extended far beyond individual capability. Her intelligence and magical abilities had reached levels that qualified her as a full participant in curriculum planning and student mentorship, creating opportunities for magical education that incorporated perspectives and techniques that purely human instruction could never provide. The financial resources necessary for establishing and maintaining an independent academy came from multiple sources that reflected the broad coalition of support that Harry's campaign for justice and reform had attracted. His inherited wealth from the Potter family vaults provided substantial foundation funding, while donations from progressive magical families and organizations offered ongoing operational support. More significantly, the international magical community had taken notice of the educational innovations that were emerging from Harry's unique circumstances and experiences. Magical schools and research institutions throughout Europe and beyond were offering partnership opportunities and exchange programs that could provide students with global perspectives and advanced learning opportunities that even traditional elite institutions could not match. The legal framework for operating an independent magical academy required navigation of complex regulatory requirements and political considerations that reflected ongoing tensions between reform movements and entrenched interests throughout wizarding society. Professor Babbling's scholarly connections and Remus's knowledge of magical law provided expertise necessary for ensuring that their innovations remained within legal boundaries while pushing the limits of what existing regulations would permit. But perhaps the most important aspect of their legal preparations was the establishment of protective measures that would prevent their academy and its students from being subjected to the kinds of manipulation and interference that had characterized Harry's own educational experience. The institution would be governed by principles that prioritized student welfare and autonomy over political convenience or institutional control. The magical protections that surrounded Grimmauld Place had been expanded and enhanced to serve the security needs of an educational institution that would necessarily attract attention from various parties with different agendas and motivations. The defensive enchantments drew on multiple magical traditions while incorporating innovations that reflected their unconventional approach to magical practice and their commitment to protecting vulnerable students from external threats. The healing work that continued throughout these months of planning and preparation extended beyond individual recovery to encompass broader questions about how magical society could evolve to better serve all its members, rather than privileging those who fit easily into existing categories and expectations. Harry's transformation from victim to catalyst had demonstrated possibilities for positive change that challenged fundamental assumptions about power, authority, and social organization. The research that Professor Babbling pursued during this period built upon her earlier investigations into trauma-induced magical development to explore broader questions about alternative approaches to magical education and therapeutic intervention. Her scholarly work was contributing to international discussions about magical pedagogy and child development that could influence policy and practice throughout the global wizarding community. The political implications of their educational experiment extended far beyond simple institutional innovation to encompass questions about the future direction of magical society and the relationships between individual autonomy and collective responsibility. Their academy would serve as a demonstration project for alternative approaches to magical education that emphasized empowerment and social engagement rather than passive compliance and institutional control. The opposition that their plans attracted from conservative elements throughout wizarding society was both expected and instructive, revealing the depth of resistance to changes that would challenge existing power structures and privilege arrangements. The forces that opposed them represented the same attitudes and assumptions that had enabled Harry's abuse and Sirius's false imprisonment, confirming the importance of their work while highlighting the challenges they would face. But the support that emerged from progressive magical families, reform-minded educators, and marginalized communities throughout wizarding society demonstrated that significant constituencies were ready for the kinds of changes that their academy represented. The coalition that formed around their educational mission provided both practical resources and moral validation for their efforts to create genuine alternatives to institutional inadequacy and systematic exclusion. The magical innovations that emerged from Harry's continued development during this period reflected the ongoing evolution of his abilities and his growing understanding of the responsibilities that accompanied his unique position and capabilities. His techniques for integrating human consciousness with animal instincts had applications for magical healing and therapeutic intervention that could benefit many practitioners who had suffered trauma or developmental disruption. More importantly, his approach to magical practice emphasized ethical considerations and social responsibility in ways that challenged conventional assumptions about power and its proper use. The magical education he would provide to future students would prioritize wisdom and compassion alongside technical capability, creating practitioners who could contribute positively to magical society rather than simply pursuing personal advancement and accumulation of power. The family relationships that had formed around Harry's journey provided both emotional foundation and practical support for the ambitious projects they were undertaking together. Sirius's recovery from his Azkaban ordeal had been remarkable not only for its speed, but for the ways in which his renewed vitality and purpose had enhanced rather than competed with the other relationships that comprised their unconventional household. The daily routines that structured life at Grimmauld Place reflected values and priorities that had emerged from their collective experiences of trauma, healing, and empowerment. Meals were shared occasions for discussion and planning rather than simple sustenance, while evening gatherings provided opportunities for magical practice, research collaboration, and the kind of genuine companionship that had been absent from all their lives during their periods of isolation and struggle. The magical creatures that had begun gathering around their household represented both validation of their approach and practical enhancement of their capabilities and resources. Hedwig's presence had attracted other enhanced familiars and magical creatures whose intelligence and abilities had been elevated through exposure to the unique magical environment they had created together. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was Harry's growing confidence in his ability to make choices about his future that reflected his own values and priorities rather than external expectations or political pressures. The boy who had once been powerless to influence even the smallest aspects of his daily routine had become someone capable of shaping institutions and influencing social change according to principles that he had developed through careful consideration and genuine moral reflection. The autumn morning when final preparations for their academy reached completion marked not only the fulfillment of months of intensive planning and development, but also the beginning of a new chapter in Harry's life that would be defined by service to others rather than simply personal survival and growth. His transformation from victim to healer represented possibilities for positive change that extended far beyond individual achievement to encompass collective empowerment and social justice. The students who would soon arrive at their academy would find an educational environment unlike anything that had existed previously in magical education. They would be encouraged to explore their unique capabilities while developing the ethical foundations necessary for responsible use of power and genuine contribution to magical society's continued evolution toward greater justice and inclusion. The magical techniques that would be taught at their academy combined traditional wizarding knowledge with innovations that reflected alternative approaches to magical practice and development. Students would learn not only how to cast spells and brew potions, but also how to integrate magical abilities with moral reasoning and social responsibility in ways that created practitioners capable of positive leadership and constructive change. As Harry stood in the renovated library of Grimmauld Place, surrounded by the family he had chosen and the allies who had supported his journey from powerlessness to empowerment, he understood that his transformation was entering its final phase. The boy who had learned to survive was becoming someone whose life's work would focus on ensuring that other vulnerable magical children would have opportunities for growth and development that he had been forced to create for himself through desperate necessity and extraordinary circumstances. The academy that would soon open its doors represented not only educational innovation, but also hope for a magical society that could evolve beyond the patterns of exclusion and exploitation that had characterized its development for centuries. The students who would benefit from their alternative approach to magical education would carry forward possibilities for positive change that could influence magical society's development for generations to come. The healing that had begun with Harry's desperate transformation in a cupboard under the stairs had evolved into something that could benefit countless others who had been marginalized or failed by existing institutions and social arrangements. The boy who had once been locked away from the magical world had become a key to unlocking possibilities for reform and empowerment that could reshape the fundamental relationships between power and responsibility in magical society. The morning of Harry's 11th birthday dawned clear and bright over the grounds of the Potter Black Academy for Magical Excellence, its golden light streaming through the tall windows of the Great Hall, where 43 students from across the magical world gathered for their daily assembly. The converted estate that had once served as a country retreat for the Black family now bustled with the energy and excitement of young practitioners whose abilities and circumstances had found no welcome in traditional magical institutions, but who had discovered here something far more valuable than simple acceptance, genuine understanding, and unlimited possibility. Harry stood before the assembled students in his role as youngest faculty member and co-founder, his form shifting fluidly between human and owl characteristics as he demonstrated the integration of dual consciousness that had become his signature contribution to magical education theory. At 11 years old, he was chronologically younger than many of his students, but his experiences and development had given him insights into magical practice and ethical leadership that challenged conventional assumptions about age and authority in educational settings. 1 year had passed since the Academy's official opening, 1 year of intensive development and remarkable achievements that had attracted attention from progressive educators throughout the international magical community. The institution had evolved beyond their most optimistic projections to become not only a sanctuary for marginalized students, but a center of innovation that was influencing magical education policy and practice in countries throughout Europe and beyond. The students who filled the Great Hall represented every category of magical practitioner who had been failed or excluded by traditional educational institutions. Muggle-born children whose families could not navigate wizarding society sat beside young werewolves who faced systematic discrimination, while students whose magical abilities manifested in unconventional ways worked alongside those whose cultural backgrounds had been dismissed as primitive or irrelevant by mainstream magical education. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Academy was not the diversity of its student body, but the way in which that diversity had become a source of strength and innovation rather than division and conflict. The educational philosophy that Harry and his colleagues had developed emphasized collaboration and mutual support, creating an environment where differences in background and ability became opportunities for learning and growth rather than sources of competition or exclusion. Hermione Granger's presence among the student body represented one of the Academy's greatest successes and most significant validations. The brilliant young witch whose parents had struggled to understand the magical world's expectations and limitations had found at the Academy not only intellectual challenge, but also the kind of ethical framework and social consciousness that aligned with her deepest values and aspirations. Her friendship with Harry had developed beyond simple academic partnership to encompass shared commitment to using magical knowledge and capability in service of justice and social progress. Their collaboration on research projects that bridged magical theory and practical application had produced innovations that were attracting attention from scholars and practitioners throughout the international magical community. The magical techniques that formed the core curriculum at the Academy drew upon traditions from every corner of the global magical community, synthesized and adapted to serve students whose needs could not be met by any single cultural or theoretical approach. Harry's unique dual nature had provided insights into integration and balance that allowed seemingly incompatible magical traditions to be combined in ways that enhanced rather than diminished their individual strengths. But the most significant innovation in their educational approach was the emphasis on ethical development and social responsibility that permeated every aspect of instruction and community life. Students learned not only how to perform magic, but also how to evaluate the moral implications of their choices and consider the broader social consequences of magical practice in a world where power disparities could create or perpetuate injustice. Professor Bathsheba Babbling's role as head of theoretical studies had evolved far beyond her original research interests to encompass leadership in educational innovation that was influencing magical pedagogy throughout the international academic community. Her scholarly work on trauma-informed magical education had become required reading in teacher training programs, while her practical demonstrations of alternative instructional methods were being adopted by progressive educators in traditional institutions. The healing work that continued throughout the academy community reflected the understanding that education and therapy were not separate processes, but integrated aspects of human development that required coordinated attention and support. Every student received not only academic instruction, but also whatever emotional and psychological support their individual circumstances required, creating an environment where learning could occur without the fear and stress that had characterized many of their previous educational experiences. Sirius Black's transformation from wrongfully imprisoned fugitive to beloved instructor in defense against the dark arts demonstrated the Academy's commitment to second chances and redemptive growth that extended beyond student services to encompass faculty development and community building. His classes emphasized practical survival skills and ethical decision-making under pressure, preparing students for a magical world that could be dangerous for those who existed outside conventional social protections. More importantly, Sirius's presence provided living proof that trauma and injustice did not have to define individual identity or limit future possibilities. His recovery and renewed purpose inspired students who had faced their own experiences of marginalization and abuse, demonstrating that healing and empowerment were always possible when supported by genuine community and principled commitment to positive change. Remus Lupin's work as coordinator of student affairs addressed the complex social and emotional needs of young practitioners whose backgrounds and circumstances required individualized support and advocacy. His own experience with discrimination and marginalization had given him understanding of the challenges that unconventional students faced, while his academic training provided practical knowledge about developmental psychology and educational methodology. The pastoral care program that he had developed addressed not only immediate student welfare, but also long-term preparation for adult life in a magical society that would continue to present challenges and opportunities for those who chose to work for positive social change. Students learned not only academic subjects, but also practical skills in communication, advocacy, and community organizing that would serve them throughout their lives as engaged magical citizens. Hedwig's role within the academy community had evolved to encompass responsibilities that challenged every assumption about the limitations of non-human intelligence and capability. Her magical development had progressed to levels that qualified her as a full faculty member, whose insights into consciousness, integration, and ethical reasoning contributed significantly to both curriculum development and individual student mentoring. Her classes in natural magic and consciousness integration were among the most popular and challenging offerings in the Academy's curriculum, attracting advanced students from traditional institutions who sought understanding of magical practices that their conventional education had never acknowledged or explored. Her teaching methods emphasized experiential learning and direct magical contact that produced results far beyond what theoretical instruction alone could achieve. The research programs that had developed around Harry's unique magical condition and educational innovations were contributing to academic discussions that extended far beyond the immediate practical concerns of alternative education. International conferences on magical pedagogy now regularly featured presentations from academy faculty and students, while scholarly journals devoted increasing attention to the theoretical implications of their work. The magical detection and monitoring systems that surrounded the academy represented technological innovations that were influencing security practices throughout the magical world. The defensive enchantments that protected students and faculty from external threats operated according to principles that balanced individual privacy with collective security, creating models for institutional protection that respected personal autonomy while maintaining effective safeguards. But perhaps the most significant achievement of the Academy's first year was the demonstration that alternative approaches to magical education could produce practitioners whose capabilities and ethical development exceeded what traditional institutions had achieved with far greater resources and longer historical development. The students who would graduate from their program would enter magical society equipped not only with advanced magical skills, but also with moral foundations and social consciousness that could contribute to positive change throughout their careers and communities. The international partnerships that had developed around the Academy's work reflected growing recognition that educational innovation and social progress were connected processes that required collaboration across cultural and national boundaries. Exchange programs with progressive institutions throughout Europe and beyond provided students with global perspectives and advanced learning opportunities that even elite traditional schools couldn't match. The financial stability that the Academy had achieved through careful management and diversified support base ensured that its innovative programs could continue and expand without compromise to educational quality or community values. Donations from grateful families, grants from progressive foundations, and income from consulting services provided sustainable funding that supported both current operations and future development initiatives. The political implications of the Academy's success extended far beyond educational policy to encompass broader questions about social justice and institutional reform throughout magical society. The demonstrated effectiveness of their alternative approaches to magical education was challenging assumptions about traditional institutions and creating pressure for systemic changes that could benefit practitioners throughout the magical community. The opposition that their work continued to attract from conservative elements within magical society served primarily to highlight the importance of their mission and the resistance that meaningful reform would necessarily encounter. The forces that opposed them represented the same attitudes and assumptions that had enabled systematic abuse and exclusion for centuries, confirming that their work addressed fundamental rather than superficial problems. But the support that emerged from progressive magical families, reform-minded educators, and marginalized communities throughout the international magical world demonstrated that significant constituencies were ready for the kinds of changes that their academy represented. The coalition that had formed around their educational mission provided both practical resources and moral validation for their efforts to create genuine alternatives to institutional inadequacy. The magical innovations that emerged from the Academy's research programs were contributing to technological and theoretical advances that influenced magical practice throughout the academic and professional communities. Student projects in applied magical research had produced results that were attracting attention from established practitioners and researchers, demonstrating that alternative educational approaches could generate knowledge and capability that traditional methods had failed to develop. The community relationships that surrounded the Academy reflected its commitment to engagement with broader magical society, rather than isolation from mainstream institutions and concerns. Student service projects addressed practical needs throughout local magical communities, while faculty consulting work contributed to reform efforts in traditional educational and governmental institutions. The daily life of the Academy community reflected values and priorities that had emerged from collective commitment to principles of respect, empowerment, and social responsibility. Students participated in governance decisions that affected their educational experience, while faculty collaborated as equals in curriculum development and policy formation that prioritized community welfare over institutional convenience or political considerations. The magical protection rituals that marked significant community events and transitions demonstrated the Academy's integration of ceremonial practice with educational and therapeutic objectives. These gatherings served not only social functions, but also practical magical purposes that strengthened community bonds and enhanced individual development within a supportive collective framework. Harry's personal development during this remarkable year had continued along trajectories that defied conventional understanding of magical and psychological growth. His mastery of dual consciousness integration had reached levels that allowed him to serve simultaneously as instructor, researcher, and community leader, while maintaining the emotional balance and moral clarity that had been established during his therapeutic transformation. His relationship with magical practice had evolved to encompass not only personal capability, but also ethical teaching and mentoring that helped other students develop their own approaches to responsible power use and social engagement. His unique perspective, as someone who had experienced both powerlessness and empowerment, provided credibility and insight that enhanced his effectiveness as educator and advocate. The academic achievements of Academy students in comparative testing and external evaluations had exceeded expectations and challenged assumptions about the relationship between alternative educational methods and measurable learning outcomes. Students who had been written off as unteachable or unsuitable for academic achievement were demonstrating capabilities that surpassed those of their peers in traditional institutions. But perhaps more importantly, the personal growth and psychological development evident in students who had arrived damaged by previous educational experiences or social marginalization provided validation for the Academy's holistic approach to human development and community building. Young practitioners who had never experienced genuine acceptance and support were blossoming into confident individuals capable of leadership and positive contribution to magical society. The international recognition that the Academy had achieved during its first year included official commendations from educational ministries, invitations to participate in policy development committees, and requests for consultation on reform initiatives throughout the magical world. Their work was influencing discussions about educational equity and social justice that extended far beyond magical communities to encompass broader questions about institutional responsibility and individual empowerment. The magical research facilities that had been established at the Academy were contributing to scholarly work that bridged theoretical investigation and practical application in ways that traditional academic institutions had struggled to achieve. Student involvement in advanced research projects provided learning opportunities that would have been impossible in conventional educational settings, while producing results that advanced knowledge throughout relevant academic fields. The graduation ceremony that would mark the completion of the Academy's first full academic year promised to be an event of international significance, with representatives from progressive educational institutions and reform organizations throughout the magical world planning to attend. The students who would receive their certificates of completion would be entering magical society as practitioners whose capabilities and ethical development represented possibilities for positive change that extended far beyond individual achievement. As Harry stood before the assembled Academy community on the morning of his 11th birthday, preparing to address students whose lives had been transformed by the opportunities and support they had found within these walls, he reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him from a locked cupboard to a position where he could influence educational policy and social development throughout the international magical community. The boy who had once been powerless to defend himself against his uncle's rage had become someone whose voice carried weight in discussions about justice, equity, and institutional reform that would influence magical society's development for generations to come. His transformation from victim to catalyst had demonstrated that individual healing and social change were connected processes that could reinforce and strengthen each other when supported by principled community and genuine commitment to shared values. The academy that bore his name would continue to serve marginalized students and challenge conventional assumptions about magical education long after he had moved on to other forms of service and contribution. The institution he had helped create represented not only educational innovation, but also hope for a magical society that could evolve beyond patterns of exclusion and exploitation that had characterized its development for too long. But perhaps the most significant achievement of Harry's transformation was not the institutional changes he had helped create or the students he had taught, but the demonstration that healing and empowerment were always possible when supported by genuine community and principled resistance to injustice. His journey from powerlessness to purpose had created possibilities for positive change that extended far beyond his individual story to encompass collective hope for a more just and inclusive magical world. The snowy owl that had emerged from a cupboard under the stairs had learned to fly not only for his own freedom, but for the liberation of others who had been trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The boy who had discovered his power through desperate necessity had chosen to use that power in service of ensuring that no other magical child would have to face alone the challenges that he had overcome through extraordinary courage and the support of allies who believed in the possibility of something better. The sensation of flight was unlike anything Harry had ever experienced, and yet somehow his transformed body knew exactly what to do. His wings caught the cool night air with an instinctive grace that belonged to countless generations of owls before him, carrying him higher and faster than his 7-year-old human mind could fully comprehend. The streetlights of Privet Drive spread out below him like fallen stars, each one marking a house where normal families lived normal lives, blissfully unaware that a boy had just become something impossible. Harry's owl consciousness struggled to maintain coherence as competing instincts warred within his transformed mind. The human part of him was screaming in terror, desperate to understand what had happened and how to reverse it. But the owl part of him was pure, focused, concerned only with immediate survival and the exhilarating freedom of the hunt. The two perspectives created a disorienting mental cacophony that made it difficult to think clearly about anything. His enhanced vision revealed the world in extraordinary detail. Every blade of grass cast its own tiny shadow in the moonlight. Every small movement in the suburban landscape registered as either potential threat or potential prey. The owl's eyes could detect the minute vibrations of mice moving through the undergrowth, the subtle warmth signatures of cats prowling through back gardens, the complex network of scents and sounds that painted a rich sensory picture of the nighttime world. But beneath the overwhelming flood of new sensory information, Harry's human consciousness clung desperately to fragments of who he had been. He remembered the cupboard, remembered Uncle Vernon's rage, remembered the terrible certainty that this time the beating would not stop until something permanently broke. The transformation had saved him from that fate. But at what cost? How could a 7-year-old boy possibly survive, trapped inside the body of an owl? The immediate problem was where to go. Harry's enhanced owl senses could detect the general direction of open countryside beyond Little Whinging, but his human mind was drawn to something else entirely. There was a pull, faint but unmistakable, leading him toward a place that felt significant in ways he couldn't articulate. It was as if some deep part of his magical nature recognized something important in that direction, something that called to him with the promise of answers or safety or understanding. Following that inexplicable instinct, Harry banked to the left and began flying northwest, away from the suburban sprawl of Little Whinging, and toward the rolling hills and ancient villages that dotted the English countryside. His owl body moved with effortless efficiency, powerful wing beats carrying him miles with each passing minute. The night air was crisp and clean, unmarked by the stale fear and desperation that had permeated every breath he had taken while trapped in the Dursleys' house. For the first time in his conscious memory, Harry was completely free. No locked doors, no threatening voices, no constant vigilance against the next punishment or humiliation. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. As he flew, Harry became gradually aware of other flying creatures sharing the night sky. Bats flitted through the darkness in erratic patterns, their high-pitched echolocation calls creating a constant background chatter that his owl ears could detect with crystal clarity. Other owls moved through the shadows with silent purpose, their presence registering as both kinship and potential territorial threat. Most gave him a wide berth, perhaps sensing something unusual about this particular snowy owl flying alone through the darkness. Time became fluid in a way that Harry's human mind struggled to track. Minutes or hours could have passed as he followed that mysterious internal compass, his enhanced stamina carrying him far from the suburban prison that had defined his entire existence. The landscape below shifted from neat rows of identical houses to rolling farmland, from modern streetlights to occasional cottage windows glowing warmly in the darkness. And then he saw it, a village that seemed to shimmer with something more than moonlight, its ancient stone buildings and narrow lanes radiating a sense of history and significance that made his transformed consciousness resonate like a struck bell. Even from high above, Harry could sense that this place was different, special in ways that had nothing to do with its picturesque appearance. Godric's Hollow. The name came to him without conscious thought, rising from some deep well of inherited memory or instinctive magical recognition. This was the place his parents had lived and died, the place where his story had truly begun. His owl body circled lower, drawn by forces he couldn't understand but felt powerless to resist. The village at night was a patchwork of shadows and gentle light. Most windows were dark, their occupants long since retired to bed. But here and there a lamp still burned in a late-night vigil. Harry's enhanced vision could see through many of the windows, revealing glimpses of normal domestic life that seemed impossibly distant from his current predicament. As he descended, searching for a suitable place to rest and gather his scattered thoughts, movement in the trees near the village cemetery caught his attention. Another owl perched on a branch that overlooked the oldest section of the graveyard, its white plumage almost glowing in the pale moonlight. Even from a distance, Harry could tell that this was a snowy owl like himself, but larger and more mature, with an air of intelligence that seemed almost human in its intensity. The other owl noticed his approach immediately, turning its head with that characteristic 90-degree rotation that allowed owls to track movement without shifting their bodies. For a moment, the two birds simply regarded each other across the darkness, and Harry felt a strange sense of recognition that had nothing to do with species similarity. Something about this owl was different, important, as if their meeting was not the random encounter it appeared to be, but rather the fulfillment of some cosmic appointment that had been arranged long before either of them had taken flight. Harry landed clumsily on a branch several trees away, his inexperience with owl locomotion evident in the awkward scramble required to find his balance. His talons gripped the bark with instinctive strength, but his landing technique was clearly that of a novice. The other owl watched this display with what could only be described as patient amusement, head tilted in a gesture that reminded Harry oddly of a teacher observing a struggling student. Once he was securely perched, Harry tried to call out to the other owl using the vocal sounds that seemed natural to his transformed throat. What emerged was a series of hoots and clicks that sounded appropriately owl-like to his own ears, but the response he received was startling in its complexity and apparent meaning. The other owl's reply was not the simple territorial challenge or mating call he might have expected. Instead, it was a sophisticated sequence of vocalizations that seemed to carry layers of meaning beyond mere animal communication. There were questions in those sounds, expressions of concern and curiosity that spoke to an intelligence far beyond normal owl cognition. More surprising still was Harry's ability to understand portions of what was being communicated. Not in words exactly, but in concepts and emotions that translated directly to his consciousness. The other owl was asking who he was, where he had come from, why he carried the scent of human habitation and magical transformation. Harry attempted to respond, but his own vocalizations came out as confused mixture of human thoughts trying to express themselves through owl vocal cords. The result was a frustrated series of hoots and screeches that conveyed his distress more clearly than any attempt at coherent communication. The other owl listened to this outburst with evident concern, then spread its wings and glided silently across the space between them. Up close, Harry could see that this was unmistakably a female, older and more experienced than his own transformed body, with scars on her feet that spoke of many hunts and countless nights of survival in the wild. Her eyes were large and bright, with an intelligence that seemed to look directly through his owl exterior to the confused human consciousness trapped within. She settled on the branch beside him with graceful precision, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her feathered body. Her presence was somehow comforting, like finding an unexpected ally in hostile territory. She began making soft, rhythmic sounds that Harry's owl instincts interpreted as comfort calls, the kind of vocalizations parent birds use to calm distressed offspring. The gentle sounds worked more effectively than Harry would have thought possible. The constant background panic that had been driving him since the transformation began to recede, replaced by a sense of safety that he had not experienced since his earliest childhood memories. For the first time since awakening in owl form, he felt as though he might not be completely alone in facing this impossible situation. The female owl seemed to understand that he was not what he appeared to be. Her behavior toward him was unlike anything he might have expected from a wild creature encountering a member of its own species. She treated him with the careful consideration one might show to an injured or traumatized individual, offering companionship without demanding the normal territorial negotiations that would have been required between two predators sharing the same hunting ground. As the night wore on, she began what could only be described as a gentle education. Using a combination of demonstration and patient repetition, she showed Harry how to properly use his transformed body, how to shift his weight for optimal balance on a branch, how to angle his head to achieve the best acoustic positioning for detecting small sounds in the darkness below, how to spread his wings for maximum silent efficiency during flight. Each lesson was offered without expectation of immediate success, with the kind of patience that suggested she understood he was working with limitations that had nothing to do with physical capability. When Harry's attempts to mimic her movements failed or resulted in undignified scrambling, she simply waited for him to regain his composure and tried again with slight variations in her demonstration technique. The most remarkable discovery came when she began attempting more complex forms of communication. Moving beyond the simple comfort calls and instructional demonstrations, she started producing sequences of sounds that carried what Harry could only describe as narrative content. Stories, told in the rich tonal language of her species, about the territory they were sharing and the creatures that lived within it. Harry found himself understanding more of these communications than should have been possible. Images formed in his mind as she spoke. Pictures of the village below and its hidden magical residents, of the ancient cemetery where powerful wizards lay buried beneath carved stone monuments, of the house where terrible events had occurred years ago and left lingering traces of magic that sensitive creatures could still detect. She was telling him about his parents. The realization hit Harry with stunning force. This owl, this impossibly intelligent and understanding creature, somehow knew who he was and what had brought him here. Her stories painted pictures of the night when green light had torn through the darkness and left a baby crying in the ruins of what had been a warm and loving home. She spoke of the magical resonance that still clung to that place, drawing sensitive souls back to witness the echoes of events that had shaped the wizarding world. But more than simple historical narrative, her communications carried emotional weight that suggested personal connection to those long-ago events. This was not the detached recounting of an outside observer, but the memories of someone who had been present who had witnessed the tragedy firsthand and carried the weight of it through the intervening years. As dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, painting the sky in gentle shades of pink and gold, Harry finally understood the truth about his mysterious companion. This was no ordinary owl who had happened to find him wandering lost and confused through the night. This was Hedwig, the snowy owl who would have been given to him as an 11th birthday present, somehow drawn to find him years before their intended meeting. The knowledge came to him not through logical deduction, but through the kind of deep, magical recognition that transcended normal understanding. Their bond, which should have been formed years in the future through the simple transaction of a birthday gift, had instead been forged in this moment of desperate need. Magic, it seemed, had its own sense of timing and propriety. Hedwig's presence beside him, as the sun rose over Godric's Hollow, felt like coming home to a place he had never been, but had always belonged to. Her patient teaching and gentle companionship had given him hope that perhaps his transformation was not the catastrophic disaster he had initially believed it to be. Perhaps there were possibilities he had not yet considered, paths forward that did not require him to remain forever trapped in a form that was not his own. But as the morning light grew stronger and the human world began to stir with the sounds of awakening households, Harry became acutely aware of the practical challenges that lay ahead. He was a 7-year-old boy trapped in the body of an owl, with no idea how to reverse his transformation or survive in a world that would not understand what he had become. His brief taste of freedom and companionship was remarkable, but it did not solve the fundamental problem of his existence. Hedwig seemed to sense his growing anxiety as the full scope of his situation became clear in the light of day. Her communications shifted from gentle comfort to something more purposeful and directive. She was trying to tell him something important, something about survival and safety and the choices that lay ahead. Through her complex vocalizations and the strange mental connection they were developing, Harry began to understand that Hedwig was offering him something unprecedented, the chance to truly learn how to be an owl while retaining his human consciousness, not as a temporary disguise or magical trick, but as a genuine dual existence that would allow him to access both worlds when the time came. The concept was both thrilling and terrifying. To accept her offer would mean abandoning any immediate hope of returning to human form, at least until he had mastered the skills necessary to survive in this new existence. But it would also mean freedom from the Dursleys, from the constant fear and pain that had defined his entire life up to this point. It would mean having Hedwig as a guide and companion, someone who understood both what he was and what he needed to become. As the village below began showing signs of morning activity, Harry made his choice. If magic had transformed him into an owl for reasons he could not yet understand, then perhaps the wisest course was to embrace that transformation fully and learn everything it had to teach him. Hedwig had survived alone in the wild, had developed intelligence and capabilities far beyond those of ordinary owls, and she was offering to share those skills with him. He communicated his decision through the increasingly sophisticated language they were developing together, a mixture of owl vocalizations and something deeper that bypassed species barriers entirely. Hedwig's response was unmistakable approval, mixed with determination. She would teach him everything she knew about survival, about hunting, about the secret world that existed parallel to human society, but remained hidden from their understanding. But first, they needed to find a safer place to establish their base of operations. Godric's Hollow, for all its emotional significance, was too visible and too heavily monitored by magical authorities who would ask uncomfortable questions about unusual owl behavior. They needed somewhere remote, somewhere they could practice and learn without interference from the adult wizarding world. Hedwig launched herself from their shared perch and began flying west toward the wilder country where ancient forests provided shelter for creatures that preferred to remain undisturbed. Harry followed, his flying technique already showing improvement from her patient instruction the night before. Together they soared over the awakening countryside, two white shapes against the morning sky, bound together by magic and necessity, and the kind of understanding that transcended the normal boundaries between species. Behind them, Godric's Hollow continued its quiet morning routine, its residents unaware that the boy who lived had paid them a visit in the dark hours before dawn. And somewhere in Little Whinging, the Dursleys were probably just discovering the empty cupboard and the mysterious hole in the ventilation grate that marked the end of their guardianship over Harry Potter. But Harry was no longer thinking about the Dursleys or their inevitable fury at discovering his escape. He was focused on the future, on the lessons Hedwig would teach him, and the skills he would need to master. He was thinking about freedom, real freedom, and the remarkable possibility that sometimes the most devastating transformation could actually be the beginning of something wonderful. The morning sun climbed higher as they flew toward their new life together, painting the world below in shades of gold and possibility that Harry had never imagined could exist. For the first time in his 7 years of existence, he was flying toward something better rather than running away from something terrible, and beside him flew the most extraordinary companion he could have asked for, a creature who understood both what he had been and what he was becoming. Whatever challenges lay ahead in learning to live as an owl while maintaining his human consciousness, Harry knew he would not have to face them alone. Hedwig was with him, and that made all the difference in the world. 3 weeks had passed since Harry's transformation, and the boy who had once lived in a cupboard under the stairs now understood what it meant to truly live. The ancient oak forest that Hedwig had led him to stretched for miles across the Scottish Highlands, a wilderness preserve protected by both government conservation laws and subtle magical wards that discouraged casual human intrusion. Here, among trees that had stood for centuries and wildlife that had learned to thrive far from human interference, Harry was learning to become something he had never imagined possible. His body had adapted to owl life with a speed that would have amazed any student of magical transformation. What had begun as clumsy, terrifying unfamiliarity had evolved into graceful competence through Hedwig's patient instruction and his own desperate determination to survive. Harry could now perch securely on branches that would have seemed impossibly narrow and precarious to his human sensibilities. His talons gripped bark and stone with the automatic certainty of limbs that had been born for this purpose, and his wings carried him through the canopy with the kind of fluid precision that spoke to muscles and reflexes finally working in perfect harmony. But perhaps the most remarkable change was not physical at all. Harry had discovered that his human consciousness, rather than being an impediment to his owl existence, had actually enhanced it in ways that defied normal understanding. Where other owls operated purely on instinct and inherited behavior patterns, Harry could think, plan, and adapt his hunting strategies with the kind of creative intelligence that gave him advantages no wild bird could match. The morning hunt had become his favorite time of day. As dawn broke over the forest canopy and the world below began stirring with the movements of small creatures seeking breakfast, Harry would launch himself from the hollow oak that he and Hedwig had claimed as their primary roost. His flight pattern had evolved from random searching to systematic coverage of territory, quartering the ground below with methodical precision that ensured no potential prey escaped his notice. Today's hunt began like many others, with Hedwig providing silent guidance from her position high above, while Harry practiced the techniques she had spent weeks teaching him. The art of the hunt, Harry had learned, was about far more than simply swooping down on any movement that caught his eye. It required patience, observation, and the ability to read the complex network of signs that revealed where prey animals were likely to be found. Harry circled above a small clearing where the morning sun had created a patch of warmth that would attract rodents seeking to bask in the early light. His enhanced vision could detect the minute trails in the grass that marked regular travel paths for mice and voles, the subtle disturbances in leaf litter that indicated recent feeding activity, the almost invisible movements that betrayed the presence of creatures trying their best to remain hidden. A flash of movement near the base of a fallen log caught his attention, and Harry adjusted his position to get a better view. A field mouse, plump and unwary, had emerged from its burrow to forage among the seeds that had fallen from the oak trees above. The creature moved with the quick, nervous energy of prey animals, pausing frequently to scan for threats before returning to its feeding. Harry felt the familiar conflict that had marked every hunt since his transformation. His human consciousness recoiled at the idea of killing another living creature, especially one so small and defenseless. But his owl body required fresh meat to maintain the strength and agility that his survival depended on, and Hedwig had made it clear that squeamishness about the realities of predator life would quickly lead to starvation. He had tried, in those first desperate days, to survive on the insects and plant matter that his human sensibilities found more acceptable. The results had been disastrous. His owl metabolism demanded the concentrated nutrition that only fresh prey could provide, and his attempts to avoid killing had left him weak, dizzy, and unable to fly with anything approaching competence. Hedwig had eventually intervened with the kind of firm guidance that brooked no argument, presenting him with freshly killed mice and making it clear that refusing them was not an option. The first time Harry had eaten raw meat, he had been certain he would be sick. His human mind had rebelled against every aspect of the experience, from the taste and texture to the psychological weight of consuming something that had been alive only moments before. But his owl body had responded with deep satisfaction and renewed energy, and gradually Harry had come to accept that this was simply the price of his new existence. Now, watching the field mouse below, Harry felt less internal conflict than practical consideration. His hunting skills had improved dramatically under Hedwig's tutelage, but he still missed more often than he succeeded. Each failed attempt meant wasted energy and lost opportunity, and in the wild, such inefficiency could quickly become life-threatening. Harry positioned himself carefully, taking into account wind direction, the angle of his approach, and the likely escape routes the mouse might choose if it detected his presence. Hedwig had taught him that successful hunting was 90% preparation and 10% execution. The owls that survived to old age were the ones who eliminated as many variables as possible before committing to an attack. He folded his wings and dropped into a controlled dive, his body automatically adjusting for maximum speed and accuracy. The mouse detected movement at the last possible second and attempted to bolt for the safety of its burrow. But Harry's calculations had been precise. His talons closed around the small body with the kind of clean efficiency that meant the death was instantaneous and painless. The satisfaction that flooded through Harry at his successful hunt was complex and multi-layered. His owl instincts responded with deep contentment at a job well done, while his human consciousness felt relief that his improving skills had prevented unnecessary suffering for his prey. There was also a growing sense of pride in his developing competence, the knowledge that he was becoming truly capable of surviving in this new existence. Hedwig's approving hoot echoed through the forest as she witnessed his clean kill. Over the weeks of their partnership, she had developed what could only be described as a teaching methodology, providing feedback on his technique with the kind of systematic analysis that reminded Harry oddly of what he imagined school might be like. Her approval had become important to him in ways that went beyond simple survival needs. Harry carried his catch back to their shared roost, settling on the broad branch that had become his customary feeding perch. As he began the ritual of consuming his prey, he reflected on how dramatically his relationship with mortality had changed since his transformation. Death was no longer an abstract concept that happened to other creatures in distant places. It was an immediate, daily reality that he both depended on and participated in. But rather than making him callous or cruel, this intimate familiarity with the cycle of life and death had given Harry a deeper appreciation for the value of existence itself. Every successful hunt reminded him that his own continued survival came at a cost, and this knowledge had instilled in him a respect for life that his human upbringing had never provided. The moral complexity of his situation extended beyond simple predator-prey relationships. Harry had discovered that his enhanced intelligence allowed him to make ethical choices that normal owls could not. When he encountered young animals that had not yet had the chance to reproduce, he would often spare them in favor of older prey. When he found injured creatures that were suffering without hope of recovery, he could provide a quick, merciful end that was more humane than the lingering death that nature would otherwise have provided. These decisions required constant moral navigation that exhausted him in ways that pure physical exertion never could. Harry was learning that freedom came with responsibilities that were far more complex than he had ever imagined during his years of powerlessness with the Dursleys. As he finished his meal, Hedwig glided down to join him on their shared branch. Her presence had become the stable center of his new existence, the one constant that made everything else possible. Over the weeks of their partnership, their communication had evolved into something that transcended normal species boundaries. They had developed a shared language of vocalizations, gestures, and something deeper that felt like direct mental contact. This morning, Hedwig's communications carried a new note of urgency that immediately caught Harry's attention. Through their complex exchange of sounds and implied meanings, she began describing something unusual that she had observed during her own hunting expeditions in the more distant parts of their territory. Other owls had been behaving strangely, gathering in numbers that defied normal territorial patterns, and engaging in what appeared to be organized discussions rather than the random encounters typical of solitary predators. More disturbing still, these unusual gatherings seemed to be centered around discussions of Harry himself. Hedwig had overheard enough fragments of conversation to understand that word had spread through the owl community about the presence of something unprecedented in their territory. A snowy owl that displayed human-like intelligence and magical abilities, a creature that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between species. The news was both fascinating and deeply concerning. Harry had hoped that his transformation would allow him to blend seamlessly into the natural world, but it seemed that his dual nature made true invisibility impossible. If other owls were talking about him, how long would it be before word reached the ears of magical creatures who might report such anomalies to wizarding authorities? Hedwig's account of the owl gatherings revealed another troubling detail. The discussions were not purely observational or academic. Some of the older owls, particularly those who had established extensive territories and commanded respect among their peers, were expressing concern about the disruption that Harry's presence might bring to their carefully balanced ecosystem. There was talk of challenging him directly, of forcing him to prove his right to remain in their territory through the kind of aerial combat that determined owl social hierarchies. The prospect of fighting other owls filled Harry with dread that had nothing to do with physical fear. His enhanced intelligence and magical abilities gave him advantages that would make such combat fundamentally unfair. He could use magic to manipulate wind currents, to enhance his speed and agility beyond natural limits, or to simply overwhelm opponents through sheer supernatural force. But using such advantages would prove their point about his disruptive influence on the natural order. More troubling still was the possibility that such a confrontation might trigger the very magical detection that he had been trying to avoid. Any significant use of magic by an underage wizard would be registered by the Ministry's monitoring systems, potentially leading to investigation and discovery. Harry's freedom depended on remaining beneath the notice of the adult wizarding world, and a magical aerial battle would be exactly the kind of event that would attract unwanted attention. As Harry considered these challenges, he became aware of another presence in their territory. A new owl had appeared at the edge of the clearing below their roost, a magnificent tawny owl whose size and bearing suggested both advanced age and considerable authority within the local owl community. The creature's posture radiated the kind of confident aggression that preceded territorial challenges, and its attention was fixed directly on Harry with unmistakable intent. Hedwig's reaction was immediate and protective. She positioned herself between Harry and the potential challenger, her own body language shifting to display readiness for combat if the situation required it. Through their shared communication, she conveyed that this particular owl was known to her, a territorial patriarch who commanded respect and fear throughout the forest. His presence here was not coincidental or casual. The tawny owl launched itself from its perch and began circling their roost tree with the kind of methodical precision that suggested careful evaluation rather than immediate attack. Harry could feel the weight of its scrutiny as those ancient eyes assessed his size, his posture, his apparent level of experience and confidence. This was clearly some sort of formal challenge ritual, a testing that would determine whether Harry would be accepted into the local hierarchy or forced to leave the territory entirely. But as the circling continued, Harry began to detect something unusual about this owl's behavior. Its movements were too precise, too purposeful for a simple territorial dispute. There was an intelligence in its flight pattern that reminded him oddly of Hedwig herself, a complexity of thought that suggested capabilities beyond those of normal wild creatures. The realization hit Harry with sudden certainty. This was no ordinary owl. Like Hedwig, this creature had been touched by magic in ways that enhanced its natural intelligence and abilities. The tawny owl was not simply challenging him for territorial rights. It was evaluating him as a potential magical anomaly that might require more specialized attention. The implications were staggering. If magical creatures throughout the forest were aware of his presence and discussing what to do about him, then his secret was far less secure than he had believed. Harry's transformation might have freed him from the Dursleys, but it had also placed him in a complex web of magical politics that he did not understand and was not equipped to navigate. As if responding to his realization, the tawny owl broke from its circling pattern and approached their tree directly. It landed on a branch positioned strategically between escape and confrontation, close enough for communication, but far enough to avoid immediate conflict. When it spoke, its vocalizations carried the same enhanced complexity that marked Hedwig's communications, layers of meaning that transcended normal animal language. The message was both warning and invitation. The magical creatures of the forest had indeed become aware of Harry's presence, and his continued residence in their territory would depend on his ability to prove that he belonged among them. But rather than simple territorial combat, the test they proposed was something far more complex and dangerous. Harry was being invited to participate in something called the Joining, a magical ritual that would formally integrate him into the supernatural community that existed parallel to the normal ecosystem of the forest. The ritual would require him to demonstrate not only his magical abilities, but also his understanding of the responsibilities that came with power over others. Success would grant him permanent sanctuary and acceptance among the magical creatures who called this place home. Failure would mean exile or worse. Through Hedwig's increasingly urgent communications, Harry began to understand the full scope of what he was being asked to undertake. The Joining was not simply a test of strength or magical ability. It was a comprehensive evaluation of character, wisdom, and moral development that would determine whether he was worthy of the trust and protection that the magical community could offer. The ritual itself would take place during the next new moon, giving Harry several days to prepare both practically and psychologically for what lay ahead. But preparation would require more than simply practicing his flying or hunting skills. The Joining would test aspects of his nature that he had barely begun to explore, challenging him to demonstrate the kind of maturity and judgment that most 7-year-olds could not possibly possess. As the tawny owl departed with a formal promise to return when the moon was dark, Harry found himself facing the most important decision of his young life. He could attempt to flee the territory and seek sanctuary elsewhere, abandoning the home he had begun to build with Hedwig in favor of the uncertain safety of unknown wilderness. Or he could accept the challenge of the Joining and risk everything on his ability to prove himself worthy of acceptance among creatures whose standards and expectations he could barely imagine. The choice would determine not only his immediate future, but the entire trajectory of his existence as a being caught between human and animal nature. For the first time since his transformation, Harry was being asked to define himself not in terms of what he had escaped from, but in terms of what he hoped to become. Hedwig's support was unwavering, her communications making it clear that she believed he possessed the qualities necessary to succeed in the joining. But she also conveyed the deadly seriousness of what lay ahead, the understanding that this would be a trial unlike anything he had yet faced. The magical creatures of the forest did not offer their acceptance lightly, and those who failed their tests rarely received second chances. As the sun climbed higher and the forest around them settled into the quiet rhythms of midday, Harry began the mental preparation for the most important challenge of his transformed life. The boy who had once been powerless to defend himself against his uncle's rage would soon be tested by beings whose power dwarfed anything he had yet encountered. The outcome would determine whether his newfound freedom was real or merely a temporary reprieve from the forces that sought to control his destiny. The cottage appeared through the morning mist like something from a fairy tale, its stone walls and thatched roof speaking of centuries of careful maintenance and gentle habitation. Smoke curled from the chimney in lazy spirals that dissipated into the grey Scottish sky, and the garden that surrounded the small dwelling showed the kind of thoughtful cultivation that came from deep knowledge of both magical and mundane horticulture. Ancient roses climbed the walls in carefully trained patterns, their blooms displaying colours that shifted subtly as Harry watched from his perch high above in the surrounding oak trees. Harry had been drawn to this place by the same inexplicable instinct that had led him to Godric's Hollow weeks earlier. But this time the pull felt different. Where his journey to his parents' village had carried the weight of grief and loss, this attraction felt warm and welcoming, like the promise of safety after a long and dangerous journey. The cottage radiated an aura of scholarly tranquility that made his transformed consciousness resonate with something approaching recognition. For 3 days, Harry and Hedwig had been conducting careful surveillance of the property and its solitary inhabitant, learning the rhythms of a life lived in comfortable solitude. The woman who called this place home was clearly elderly, though her movements spoke of someone who had aged gracefully rather than being diminished by the passage of years. She tended her garden each morning with methodical care, harvested herbs with the precision of someone who understood their properties intimately, and spent long hours reading beside windows that had been positioned to catch the best possible light. But most intriguingly, she talked to herself. Not the rambling monologue of someone whose mind had begun to wander, but the focused discussions of a scholar working through complex problems aloud. Harry's enhanced hearing allowed him to catch fragments of these one-sided conversations, and what he heard suggested someone grappling with theoretical questions that went far beyond the simple concerns of domestic life. This morning, as autumn fog rolled across the highlands and created perfect camouflage for 2 white owls moving through the misty air, Harry had decided to venture closer than ever before. The upcoming trial of the joining weighed heavily on his mind, and something about this cottage and its inhabitant suggested the possibility of guidance or understanding that might prove crucial in the challenges ahead. Harry and Hedwig settled in an ancient pine that grew close enough to the cottage to provide an excellent view of the garden and the woman who was already at work among her morning glories despite the early hour. From their concealed position, they could observe without being noticed, though Harry was beginning to suspect that remaining undetected might be more difficult than he had initially assumed. The woman working among the flowers was not what Harry had expected from his distant observations. Up close, her appearance suggested someone who had spent decades immersed in academic pursuits, but her movements revealed a practical competence that spoke of equal familiarity with the physical demands of independent living. Her grey hair was pulled back in a style that was both practical and elegant, and her clothing showed the kind of quality that lasted for decades when properly cared for. As she worked, the woman maintained a running commentary that Harry gradually realized was not self-directed conversation at all. She was lecturing, presenting complex information with the kind of systematic organization that suggested long experience in teaching others. But there was no one visible to receive this instruction, which created a puzzle that made Harry's curiosity burn with increasing intensity. The mystery deepened when the woman paused in her gardening to examine a plant that showed signs of magical influence. The morning glories she was tending displayed the kind of impossible color variations that Harry had learned to associate with botanical magic, their petals shifting through spectrums that no natural flower could achieve. But rather than being surprised or concerned by these manifestations, the woman observed them with the clinical interest of someone conducting a planned experiment. She made notes in a leather-bound journal, using a quill that moved with its own volition, recording observations about magical plant behavior with the kind of systematic thoroughness that reminded Harry of the scientific method that Hedwig had been teaching him to apply to hunting strategies. This was clearly someone who understood magic, not as random, miracle, or frightening aberration, but as a natural phenomenon that could be studied and comprehended through careful observation. As Harry watched, fascinated by this display of scholarly magical investigation, the woman suddenly straightened and turned her attention directly toward his concealed position in the pine tree. Her eyes, sharp with intelligence and brightened by genuine curiosity, seemed to look through the concealing branches and morning mist to focus directly on him. The moment of discovery was both terrifying and oddly thrilling. Harry felt exposed in a way that went beyond simple visibility, as if those penetrating eyes could see not only his physical form, but something deeper and more fundamental about his true nature. There was no hostility in her gaze, but there was an intensity of interest that made Harry acutely aware that his period of anonymous observation had come to an abrupt end. Rather than fleeing immediately, Harry found himself frozen in place by curiosity that matched the woman's own evident fascination. This was the first human being he had encountered since his transformation, who seemed to regard his presence as interesting rather than threatening or impossible. Her reaction suggested someone who was accustomed to encountering unusual phenomena and responding to them with scientific inquiry rather than fear or rejection. The woman set down her gardening tools and approached the base of the pine tree with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent decades dealing with skittish magical creatures. Her movements were careful and non-threatening, designed to avoid triggering flight responses in animals that might bolt at any sudden motion. But her attention remained fixed on Harry's position, with an accuracy that made it clear she knew exactly where he was despite his efforts at concealment. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of educated accent that Harry associated with teachers and scholars, but it was warmed by genuine kindness that made his defensive instincts relax despite his better judgment. Her words were directed specifically toward him, though she maintained the kind of calm tone one might use when attempting to coax a frightened animal into trusting human presence. Professor Bathsheba Babbling, though Harry did not yet know her name, had spent the better part of 40 years teaching ancient runes at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Her retirement to this remote Scottish cottage had been motivated not by any desire to withdraw from magical society, but by her need for the kind of uninterrupted research time that institutional obligations had never allowed. Her current project involved the intersection between natural magic and deliberate spellwork, particularly the ways in which emotional trauma could trigger unexpected magical manifestations in young practitioners. The two snowy owls that had been conducting surveillance of her property for the past 3 days represented exactly the kind of anomaly that her research had led her to expect. Wild owls did not display the kind of systematic observation patterns that these two had demonstrated. They did not coordinate their activities with the precision of trained partners, and they most certainly did not radiate the kind of suppressed magical energy that her sensitive instruments had been detecting since their arrival. Professor Babbling had been waiting for them to reveal themselves more fully, but patience was a virtue that 40 years of teaching had instilled in her quite thoroughly. She was prepared to wait as long as necessary for the truth of their situation to become clear. This morning, however, something about the smaller owl's behavior suggested a readiness for contact that had not been present in their previous observations. She directed her words toward the pine tree with the kind of calm authority that had once managed classrooms full of restless teenagers, but gentled by the understanding that she was dealing with creatures who had every reason to be wary of human contact. Her invitation was simple and direct. If they were indeed more than they appeared to be, if they possessed the kind of intelligence that her observations suggested, then perhaps it was time for a proper introduction. Harry felt Hedwig's tension through their shared bond as the woman's words registered with startling clarity. There was no question that she was addressing them specifically, that she understood their surveillance had been deliberate rather than coincidental. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. This woman knew they were not ordinary owls, but her reaction suggested fascination rather than fear or threat. The decision to reveal himself was perhaps the most difficult Harry had faced since his transformation. Everything depended on his assessment of this woman's character and intentions. If she proved to be hostile, or if she chose to report his existence to magical authorities, his brief period of freedom would come to an abrupt and catastrophic end. But if she was truly the scholar and ally that her demeanor suggested, she might represent his best hope for understanding the magical forces that had changed his life so dramatically. Hedwig's communication carried both encouragement and warning. She sensed the same potential for aid that Harry detected, but her natural caution reminded him that humans were inherently unpredictable and that trust, once given, could not be easily withdrawn. The choice would have consequences that extended far beyond this single interaction. Harry made his decision with the kind of intuitive certainty that his transformation had taught him to trust. This woman felt safe in ways that went beyond logical analysis, and his desperate need for guidance and understanding outweighed his instinctive caution. Slowly, deliberately, he began to descend from his concealed position in the pine tree. His flight to the ground was conducted with all the grace and precision that weeks of practice with Hedwig had instilled, but as he approached the woman waiting patiently beside her garden, Harry allowed something unprecedented to occur. The suppressed magical energy that had been building within him since his transformation began to manifest in ways that no ordinary owl could achieve. Small sparks of golden light began to dance around his wings as he flew, harmless but unmistakably magical manifestations that announced his true nature more clearly than any verbal explanation could have achieved. The air around him shimmered with the kind of energy distortions that accompanied significant magical events, and when he landed on the stone wall that bordered the woman's garden, the very stones beneath his talons glowed briefly with reflected power. Professor Babbling's reaction was everything Harry had hoped for, and more. Rather than fear or shock, her expression showed the kind of delighted recognition that scholars experienced when a long-theorized phenomenon finally revealed itself for direct observation. She approached him with the careful respect due to a dangerous but fascinating magical creature, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid triggering defensive responses. When she spoke again, her words were directed specifically toward the human consciousness that she somehow understood was trapped within the owl's form. Her voice carried decades of experience in dealing with magical anomalies, but it was gentled by genuine compassion for what she correctly surmised was a child in desperate need of guidance and protection. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Harry had experienced since his transformation. Through a combination of careful questioning and patient observation, Professor Babbling gradually drew out the story of his escape from Privet Drive and his subsequent struggles to understand and control his new existence. She demonstrated an understanding of magical theory that illuminated aspects of his condition that had remained mysterious, explaining the forces that had triggered his transformation and the reasons why returning to human form had proven so difficult. More importantly, she offered something that Harry had not dared to hope for: acceptance and practical assistance from someone who possessed both the knowledge and the authority to help him navigate the magical world's complexities. Professor Babbling's years of teaching had given her extensive experience with traumatized magical children, and her research into emotion-triggered transformation made her uniquely qualified to understand both his current condition and the therapeutic approaches that might eventually restore his ability to choose his form at will. The revelation that his transformation had been caused by a combination of severe emotional trauma and magical power, seeking an outlet for expression, was both liberating and terrifying. It meant that his condition was not permanent or irreversible, but it also meant that healing would require him to confront and process the psychological damage that years of abuse had inflicted on his developing psyche. Professor Babbling's cottage, Harry learned, was warded with protective enchantments that would prevent magical authorities from detecting underage sorcery performed within its boundaries. This meant that his presence there would not automatically trigger the kind of ministry investigation that had been his greatest fear since leaving Privet Drive. For the first time since his transformation, Harry was being offered genuine sanctuary by someone who understood both what he was and what he needed to become. The professor's explanation of his magical condition revealed complexities that Harry had never imagined. His transformation had not been a simple case of accidental magic run amok, but rather his magical core's desperate attempt to protect him from psychological damage that might have proven permanently crippling. By forcing him into owl form, his magic had provided both physical escape from immediate danger and emotional distance from trauma that his 7-year-old psyche was not equipped to process. But the protective mechanism that had saved him also created new challenges that would require careful navigation. The longer Harry remained in owl form, the more natural it would become, and the more difficult it would be to return to human existence. His magic was essentially offering him a choice: remain safely removed from the human world that had treated him so badly, or develop the psychological resilience necessary to function as a human being while retaining the freedom and power that his owl form provided. Professor Babbling's guidance would be crucial in helping him make that choice consciously rather than simply defaulting to whatever felt safest in the moment. She possessed theoretical knowledge about magical transformation that even Hedwig's enhanced intelligence could not provide, and her decades of experience with troubled magical children gave her practical insights into the therapeutic process that would be required for true healing. The afternoon passed in intensive discussion as Professor Babbling outlined the magical and psychological principles that governed Harry's condition. She explained the ways in which emotional trauma could disrupt normal magical development, creating the kind of protective responses that had manifested in his transformation. She described the delicate balance between conscious will and magical instinct that would determine whether he eventually regained full control over his human and owl forms. Most importantly, she offered him something that no one else in his life ever had: time. Time to heal at his own pace, time to develop the skills and understanding he would need to make informed choices about his future, time to explore the full range of possibilities that his unique magical condition might offer. There would be no arbitrary deadlines or external pressures to conform to other people's expectations about what his life should look like. As evening approached, and Hedwig joined them in the garden for what Professor Babbling correctly identified as a bonding ritual of unusual complexity and power, Harry felt something that had been absent from his life since his earliest childhood: hope. Not the desperate, fearful hope that someday his suffering might end, but the confident expectation that his future held possibilities he had never dared to imagine. The cottage that had drawn him through magical instinct was proving to be exactly what he needed most: a place where he could be both human and owl without having to choose between them, guided by someone who understood that healing was a process that could not be rushed or forced. For the first time since his transformation, Harry began to believe that he might actually have choices about what his life would become, rather than simply surviving whatever circumstances were imposed upon him. Professor Babbling's final gift of that first day was perhaps the most precious of all. She spoke his name. Not boy or freak or any of the other dehumanizing labels that had defined his existence with the Dursleys, but Harry Potter, spoken with the kind of respect and recognition that acknowledged both his magical heritage and his individual worth. In that simple act of naming, she restored to him something that he had not even realized he had lost. As darkness settled over the Scottish Highlands, and Harry prepared to spend his first night in genuine safety since his transformation, he understood that his journey was far from over. The trial of the joining still awaited him, and the magical creatures of the forest would still demand proof of his worthiness to remain among them. But now he would face those challenges with something he had never possessed before, an adult ally who understood his true nature and was committed to helping him develop the skills and wisdom he would need to forge his own destiny. The boy who had once been powerless to defend himself against his uncle's rage was beginning to understand that power came in many forms, and that the greatest power of all might be the freedom to choose who he wanted to become. The ancient grimoire that Professor Babbling placed before Harry was bound in leather that had been treated with preservative enchantments, so old that the magic itself had become part of the book's fundamental structure. Its pages whispered with accumulated wisdom as she opened it to reveal illustrations and text that seemed to shift and move according to the reader's level of understanding. For Harry, still maintaining his owl form during their morning lessons, the book displayed simplified diagrams and explanations that gradually grew more complex as his comprehension deepened. 3 weeks had passed since Harry had first revealed himself to Professor Babbling, and the daily routine they had established felt like the closest thing to normal education he had ever experienced. Each morning, after completing his hunting practice with Hedwig, Harry would perch on the specially designed reading stand that Professor Babbling had crafted to accommodate his transformed anatomy while allowing him to participate fully in advanced magical instruction. The current lesson focused on the theoretical foundations of magical transformation, but Professor Babbling's approach went far beyond simple academic theory. She was teaching Harry to understand magic as a living force that responded to conscious intent, emotional state, and deep psychological patterns in ways that conventional wizarding education rarely acknowledged. Her decades of research into the intersection between ancient magical theory and modern psychological understanding had produced insights that challenged many assumptions about how magic actually worked. Today's particular focus was the concept of magical resonance, the way individual magical signatures could be influenced by external forces and traumatic experiences. Professor Babbling had spent weeks preparing Harry for this lesson, building his understanding gradually through examinations of simpler magical phenomena. But today, she was ready to address the specific magical conditions that had created his current situation. The diagrams in the grimoire showed the complex interplay between conscious will, subconscious protection mechanisms, and raw magical power that could create the kind of involuntary transformation Harry had experienced. But more importantly, they illustrated the ways in which such transformations could be modified, controlled, and eventually mastered by practitioners who developed sufficient understanding of their own magical nature. Professor Babbling's explanation was both illuminating and deeply disturbing. Harry's scar, she had discovered through careful magical examination, contained magical residue that was fundamentally incompatible with normal human magical development. The presence of this foreign magical signature had been disrupting his natural magical maturation since birth, creating instabilities that manifested as both enhanced power and reduced control. The night of his transformation, when his magic had finally reached a critical threshold under extreme emotional stress, his magical core had essentially made a survival decision. Rather than allowing the foreign magical influence to potentially destroy his sanity or magical ability entirely, his magic had forced him into a form where the incompatible energies could be contained and gradually processed without causing permanent psychological damage. The revelation explained not only why his transformation had been so complete and seemingly permanent, but also why returning to human form had proven so difficult. His magic was essentially protecting him from forces that his 7-year-old psyche was not equipped to handle, and would continue to maintain that protection until he developed the psychological resilience and magical understanding necessary to confront whatever was hidden in his scar. But Professor Babbling's research had uncovered another crucial detail that changed everything about Harry's situation. The foreign magical signature in his scar was not simply random dark magic or the residue of some unknown curse. It was a soul fragment, a piece of another wizard's essence that had become embedded in Harry's magical core during some traumatic event in his earliest childhood. The implications were staggering. Harry was not simply dealing with the aftermath of childhood abuse or the challenges of early magical development. He was literally carrying part of another person's soul within his own magical signature, and that fragment was actively influencing his magical development in ways that defied normal understanding. Professor Babbling's careful examination had revealed that the soul fragment was not malevolent in any conscious sense, but its presence was fundamentally incompatible with Harry's natural magical patterns. The conflict between his own magical signature and the foreign presence had been creating instabilities throughout his childhood, manifesting as the accidental magic incidents that had so enraged the Dursleys and ultimately leading to the protective transformation that had saved his sanity. More disturbing still was the discovery that someone had known about this condition and had deliberately placed Harry in an environment where proper magical development would be impossible. The blood wards that supposedly protected him at Privet Drive were not designed to keep external threats away from Harry, but rather to suppress his magical development and prevent him from discovering the truth about his condition until someone else decided he was ready to handle that knowledge. The revelation that his placement with the Dursleys had been a deliberate strategy rather than a simple bureaucratic mistake filled Harry with a rage that made his transformed body tremble with suppressed energy. Someone had known he was carrying a soul fragment that would disrupt his magical development, and instead of seeking treatment or providing proper guidance, they had chosen to isolate him in an environment where abuse and neglect would prevent him from developing the magical control necessary to investigate his own condition. Professor Babbling's research into the magical signatures involved had led her to a conclusion that she delivered with the kind of careful precision that academics used when discussing dangerous political realities. The soul fragment in Harry's scar belonged to Tom Marvolo Riddle, better known to the wizarding world as Lord Voldemort, and its presence was almost certainly the result of the attack that had killed Harry's parents when he was barely a year old. But more disturbing still was the evidence that Albus Dumbledore, chief warlock of the Wizengamot, and widely regarded as the most powerful wizard of his generation, had known about this condition and had systematically prevented Harry from receiving the kind of magical education that would allow him to understand and control the forces affecting his development. The pattern of manipulation extended far beyond simple educational neglect. Dumbledore had apparently been monitoring Harry's magical development for years, ensuring that his power remained contained and directed according to some larger strategic plan that prioritized political considerations over Harry's well-being and autonomy. The transformation that had freed Harry from Privet Drive had also disrupted whatever surveillance and control mechanisms Dumbledore had established, creating an opportunity for genuine independence that might never come again. Professor Babbling's explanation of these revelations was delivered with the kind of careful emotional support that came from decades of helping traumatized students process difficult truths. She understood that learning about the systematic manipulation and exploitation that had defined his entire life would be devastating for anyone, but particularly crushing for a 7-year-old who had already endured more trauma than most adults could survive. But she also offered something that no one else in Harry's life ever had: the knowledge and resources necessary to break free from the forces that sought to control his destiny. Her research had not only uncovered the truth about his magical condition, but had also developed theoretical approaches to resolving the soul fragment issue in ways that would restore his natural magical development without causing further psychological trauma. The process would be neither quick nor easy. Removing or neutralizing a soul fragment required delicate magical work that could only be performed by someone with extensive knowledge of both soul magic and psychological healing. More importantly, it required the active cooperation of the person carrying the fragment, which meant Harry would need to develop sufficient magical control and emotional resilience to participate consciously in his own healing. Professor Babbling's proposed treatment plan was comprehensive and ambitious. She would provide Harry with the advanced magical education that his condition required, teaching him to understand and control the forces affecting his development, while gradually building his psychological strength to handle increasingly complex magical work. The process would likely take months or even years, but it offered the possibility of genuine freedom from both the soul fragment and the political manipulation that had shaped his life. More immediately, Professor Babbling's research had revealed crucial information about the upcoming trial of the joining that Harry would face with the forest's magical creatures. The ritual was not simply a test of magical ability or character, but actually a form of therapeutic magical working designed to help beings caught between different natures achieve integration and balance. The magical creatures who had issued the challenge understood Harry's condition far better than he had realized. Their invitation to participate in the joining was not a threat or territorial dispute, but rather an offer of healing and integration that could help him achieve the kind of psychological stability necessary for the more complex magical work that Professor Babbling proposed. But accepting their help would require Harry to trust magical beings whose motivations and methods he did not fully understand, and to participate in ritual magic that could have unpredictable effects on his already complex magical condition. The choice would determine not only whether he could remain in the forest sanctuary, but also whether he would pursue the path of healing and integration that Professor Babbling offered, or seek some alternative approach to managing his transformation. As Harry processed these revelations, Hedwig had remained a constant presence beside him, her own magical development continuing to evolve in response to their deepening bond. Professor Babbling's examination had revealed that Hedwig's intelligence and magical abilities were not simply the result of natural enhancement, but rather the product of a magical familiar bond that had formed between them during Harry's transformation. The bond was unprecedented in both its depth and its effects. Rather than the simple communication and loyalty typical of wizard-familiar relationships, Harry and Hedwig had developed what Professor Babbling described as a merged magical signature that allowed them to share not only thoughts and emotions, but actual magical capabilities. Hedwig could access aspects of Harry's magical power, while Harry could utilize her natural instincts and enhanced senses even while in human form. But the bond had also changed Hedwig in fundamental ways that went beyond simple magical enhancement. Her intelligence had evolved to a level that approached human consciousness, while retaining the clarity of purpose and freedom from psychological complexity that characterized her owl nature. In many ways, she represented the kind of integrated dual nature that Harry was striving to achieve for himself. Professor Babbling's research into familiar bonds had revealed that such deep connections were extremely rare and typically formed only in circumstances of extreme magical stress or emotional intensity. The bond between Harry and Hedwig had been forged during his transformation, when his desperate need for companionship and understanding had called out to the one creature who could provide both practical survival guidance and emotional support. The implications extended far beyond simple magical partnership. Hedwig's presence in Harry's life represented a form of healing that no human intervention could provide, a connection to his animal nature that allowed him to embrace the owl aspects of his identity without losing his human consciousness. Through their bond, Harry was learning to integrate the predatory clarity of owl perception with the moral complexity of human reasoning, creating a form of awareness that transcended the limitations of either species. As the afternoon lesson progressed, Professor Babbling guided Harry through increasingly sophisticated explorations of his own magical signature, teaching him to sense and identify the various forces that influenced his magical development. The exercises required a level of introspective awareness that was challenging for anyone, but particularly difficult for a 7-year-old whose magical education had been systematically suppressed throughout his childhood. But Harry's transformation had given him advantages that Professor Babbling had not initially anticipated. His owl consciousness provided a clarity of perception and freedom from self-deception that made it easier for him to observe his own magical patterns without the emotional interference that typically complicated such work. He could sense the foreign magical signature in his scar with startling precision, and could feel the ways in which his own magical development had been shaped by its presence. More remarkably, Harry was beginning to develop conscious control over the balance between his human and owl consciousness, shifting between different modes of awareness, depending on the requirements of the task at hand. When magical work required the kind of predatory focus that came naturally to owls, he could access that state of mind without losing his human reasoning abilities. When emotional processing required the complexity of human consciousness, he could integrate his owl experiences without being overwhelmed by their intensity. The integration was not yet complete or entirely stable, but Professor Babbling recognized it as remarkable progress toward the kind of balanced dual nature that successful animagi achieved after years of training and practice. Harry was essentially accomplishing in weeks what normally took adult wizards months or years to master, driven by the desperate necessity of his situation and the unique advantages that his involuntary transformation had provided. As evening approached, and the time for serious magical work gave way to the quieter rhythms of domestic life in the cottage, Professor Babbling made a decision that would prove crucial to Harry's future development. She formally offered to serve as his magical guardian and tutor, providing him with the legal protection and educational resources that his unique situation required. The offer came with both tremendous advantages and significant risks. As Harry's guardian, Professor Babbling would have the authority to make decisions about his medical and educational needs without interference from other magical authorities. She could provide him with access to magical knowledge and resources that would otherwise be restricted to adult practitioners, and could protect him from the kind of political manipulation that had defined his early childhood. But accepting her guardianship would also mean committing to a path of healing and development that would require years of intensive magical work and psychological growth. Harry would be choosing to confront the soul fragment issue directly, rather than simply learning to manage his transformation, and would be placing his trust in someone whose motivations and long-term plans he could not fully evaluate. The decision would also affect Hedwig, whose magical development was increasingly intertwined with Harry's own growth. Accepting Professor Babbling's guidance would mean pursuing a path that emphasized integration and balance, rather than pure magical power, potentially limiting some aspects of their familiar bond in favor of broader psychological stability. As Harry considered these choices, the approaching trial of the joining took on new significance. The magical creatures of the forest had offered him a different path toward integration and healing, one that emphasized natural magical development and acceptance of dual nature rather than the systematic analysis and therapeutic intervention that Professor Babbling proposed. Both paths offered genuine possibilities for growth and healing, but they would lead him in fundamentally different directions. The choice would determine not only how he addressed his immediate magical challenges, but also what kind of person he would become as he grew from traumatized child to capable magical practitioner. The cottage that had become his sanctuary was filled with the quiet sounds of evening as Harry contemplated the most important decision of his young life. Outside, Hedwig practiced her own magical exercises in the gathering darkness, her flight patterns creating complex runic shapes that demonstrated the remarkable sophistication of their developing partnership. Inside, Professor Babbling prepared tea with the kind of domestic ritual that had sustained scholars through centuries of difficult research and challenging decisions. For the first time since his transformation, Harry was being asked to choose his future consciously, rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond his control. The boy who had once been powerless to influence even the smallest aspects of his daily existence now held the power to determine the entire trajectory of his magical development and personal growth. The responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying, but as Harry settled into his evening roost with Hedwig beside him and Professor Babbling's protective ward surrounding them both, he understood that this was what freedom actually meant. Not simply the absence of external control, but the presence of meaningful choices and the wisdom to make them well. The ancient protective ward surrounding Professor Babbling's cottage shimmered with an urgency that had not been present during the peaceful weeks of Harry's sanctuary. 2 months had passed since his first desperate flight from Privet Drive, 2 months of intensive magical education and gradual healing that had transformed him from a traumatized child into something approaching a confident young practitioner. But this morning, the magical alarms woven into the cottage's defensive enchantments sang with warnings that made both Harry and Hedwig restless with anticipatory tension. Professor Babbling emerged from her study with the kind of controlled haste that spoke of serious concern masked by academic composure. Her silver hair was more disheveled than usual, suggesting a sleepless night spent monitoring magical surveillance networks and consulting ancient texts for guidance about threats that defied conventional defensive measures. The leather satchel slung across her shoulder contained emergency supplies and research materials that had been prepared weeks ago in anticipation of this moment. The reason for her urgency became clear as she explained the magical signatures that her monitoring enchantments had detected during the night. Dumbledore himself had finally taken personal interest in the mysterious disappearance of Harry Potter, and his investigation was approaching dangerous proximity to their sanctuary. More concerning still, the magical traces left by Harry's increasingly sophisticated spellwork had begun to register on ministry detection networks, despite the cottage's protective wards. Harry's magical development under Professor Babbling's tutelage had progressed at a rate that bordered on unprecedented. His ability to maintain conscious control over his dual nature had stabilized to the point where he could shift between human and owl consciousness at will, accessing the advantages of each form while retaining the integrated awareness that made him more than either species alone could achieve. But this remarkable progress had come at the cost of magical discretion, and the sophisticated spellwork required for his healing had begun creating the kind of magical signatures that attracted unwanted attention. The soul fragment analysis that Professor Babbling had been conducting represented the culmination of months of careful research and delicate magical probing. Her investigation had revealed details about the Horcrux embedded in Harry's scar that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of soul magic and its effects on developing magical cores. But each probe and analysis created magical resonances that registered on increasingly sophisticated monitoring networks, painting a trail that skilled investigators could follow back to their source. Professor Babbling's explanation of their situation carried the weight of scholarly precision combined with genuine fear for Harry's safety and continued freedom. Dumbledore's investigation into Harry's disappearance had shifted from passive monitoring to active pursuit, suggesting that someone or something had provided information that made their sanctuary's location vulnerable to discovery. More troubling still, the investigation seemed to be coordinated with ministry officials whose motivations remained unclear, but whose authority to reclaim custody of Harry could not be easily challenged. The research that Professor Babbling had been conducting into Harry's unique magical condition had yielded discoveries that went far beyond the immediate question of soul fragment removal. Her analysis had revealed that the Horcrux in Harry's scar was not simply a passive magical parasite, but rather an active intelligence that had been influencing his magical development and psychological growth throughout his childhood. The fragment contained not only a portion of Voldemort's soul, but also elements of his magical knowledge and strategic thinking that had been subtly shaping Harry's instinctive responses to magical challenges. More disturbing still was the discovery that Harry's accidental magic incidents throughout his childhood had not been random manifestations of uncontrolled power, but rather deliberate attempts by the soul fragment to establish communication with its original owner. Each episode of magic that had enraged the Dursleys and ultimately led to his transformation had actually been a beacon, calling out to Voldemort with information about Harry's location and magical development. The implications were staggering. Harry had not simply been carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul, but had unknowingly served as an unwilling spy whose magical signature could be tracked and monitored by anyone with sufficient knowledge of Horcrux detection methods. His transformation into owl form had disrupted this tracking mechanism by fundamentally altering his magical signature, but Professor Babbling's research had necessarily reactivated some of those same detection pathways. The realization that his presence endangered not only himself, but also Professor Babbling, and potentially anyone who attempted to help him, filled Harry with a familiar sense of powerless desperation that his weeks of healing had not entirely eliminated. The boy who had begun to believe in his own agency and worth was confronted once again with evidence that forces beyond his control were manipulating his life in ways he could barely understand. But Professor Babbling's response to these revelations demonstrated the difference between the supportive guidance she offered and the helpless abandonment he had experienced with the Dursleys. Rather than rejecting him as too dangerous or too much trouble to protect, she immediately began implementing contingency plans that had been developed specifically for this eventuality. Her commitment to his welfare was not conditional on his being safe or easy to manage, but rather absolute in ways that Harry had never experienced from any adult in his life. The emergency relocation protocols that Professor Babbling activated demonstrated the thoroughness with which she had prepared for the possibility of discovery. Her ancestral estate in the remote Scottish Highlands had been warded and prepared as a secondary sanctuary, protected by magical defenses that were both more powerful and more sophisticated than those surrounding the cottage. But reaching that sanctuary would require a journey through territory that was likely being monitored by multiple interested parties, creating risks that extended far beyond simple travel challenges. More importantly, the relocation would necessarily interrupt Harry's magical treatment at a crucial stage in the soul fragment removal process. Professor Babbling's careful analysis had revealed that the Horcrux was beginning to respond to her therapeutic interventions, but the process was delicate and required consistent magical environments to prevent potentially dangerous backlash effects. Moving to a new location would mean starting over with environmental calibrations and protective protocols, potentially losing weeks or months of progress. The alternative was to attempt accelerated treatment that would either neutralize the soul fragment completely or create conditions where its influence could be permanently contained. But such aggressive intervention carried risks that made Professor Babbling's scholarly caution evident in every word of her explanation. Attempting to remove or neutralize a Horcrux without proper preparation could result in magical backlash that might kill Harry or drive him permanently insane. As Harry considered these impossible choices, Hedwig provided the kind of clear-minded analysis that had become invaluable throughout their partnership. Her communications carried both practical assessment of their tactical situation and emotional support for the psychological challenges that Harry faced. Through their enhanced familiar bond, she helped him process the complex emotions that threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational decision-making. Hedwig's own magical development had continued to evolve in remarkable ways during their time at the cottage. Her intelligence had reached levels that approached human sophistication, while retaining the predatory clarity and emotional directness that characterized her owl nature. More importantly, her bond with Harry had deepened to the point where she could access aspects of his magical abilities even when he was in human form, creating a form of distributed magical consciousness that was unprecedented in recorded magical history. Professor Babbling's research into their familiar bond had revealed that Hedwig's presence was actually stabilizing the soul fragment in ways that made therapeutic intervention safer and more effective. Her natural owl psychology provided a kind of emotional buffer that prevented the Horcrux from accessing Harry's deeper psychological vulnerabilities, while her magical enhancements allowed her to actively assist in containing its influence during treatment sessions. But Hedwig's enhanced abilities also made her a target for anyone seeking to control or manipulate Harry's development. The bond between them was so deep that harming one would necessarily damage the other, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood the nature of their connection. Their remarkable partnership was simultaneously their greatest strength and their most dangerous weakness. The morning's crisis deepened when Professor Babbling's long-range monitoring enchantments detected the distinctive magical signature of Albus Dumbledore approaching through the forest that surrounded their sanctuary. His progress was measured and deliberate, suggesting someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he expected to find when he arrived. More concerning still, he was not traveling alone. The magical signatures accompanying Dumbledore included at least 2 other powerful wizards whose identities Professor Babbling could not immediately determine, but whose magical profiles suggested aura training and ministry authorization. This was not an informal visit or concerned inquiry about a missing child, but rather an official investigation with the authority to override local magical protections and remove Harry from Professor Babbling's custody, regardless of his preferences or best interests. Professor Babbling's response to this approaching threat demonstrated both her scholarly courage and her deep commitment to Harry's autonomy and well-being. Rather than simply surrendering to superior authority, she began implementing emergency protocols that would give Harry genuine choices about his future, rather than simply accepting whatever fate external forces might impose upon him. The emergency transportation network that she activated had been prepared years earlier as part of her research into ancient magical travel methods. Unlike modern apparition or flu network connections, these transportation methods operated through natural magical currents that could not be easily tracked or intercepted by ministry monitoring systems. But using them required precise timing and magical preparation that would leave little room for error or hesitation. More importantly, the emergency protocols included options that Professor Babbling had hoped would never become necessary. Harry could choose to complete his transformation permanently, embracing his owl nature so completely that his human consciousness would become secondary, and his magical signature would be undetectable by conventional methods. This would provide absolute protection from political manipulation and unwanted interference, but would also mean abandoning any possibility of participating normally in human magical society. Alternatively, Harry could choose to undergo the accelerated Horcrux removal process despite its risks, gambling everything on the possibility that success would grant him sufficient magical independence to resist external control. But failure would likely mean death or permanent magical damage that would make his transformation struggles seem trivial by comparison. The third option was perhaps the most challenging of all. Harry could choose to confront Dumbledore directly, using the knowledge and magical skills he had gained during his sanctuary to negotiate from a position of strength rather than helpless dependence. This would require him to demonstrate magical capabilities that no 7-year-old should possess, potentially revealing the full extent of his unusual development to people whose reactions could not be predicted. As the approaching magical signatures drew closer and the time for decision shortened, Harry found himself grappling with choices that would have challenged adult practitioners with decades of experience. The boy who had once been powerless to influence even the smallest aspects of his daily routine now held the power to determine not only his own future, but potentially the balance of power in the ongoing conflict between those who sought to control his destiny and those who supported his right to choose his own path. Professor Babbling's final preparation involved a magical ritual that would temporarily sever her own connection to the ministry's monitoring networks, making it impossible for her to be tracked or compelled to reveal information about Harry's location or condition. But performing this ritual would also make her a fugitive from magical law, subject to arrest and imprisonment if she were discovered. Her willingness to sacrifice her own security and reputation for Harry's freedom demonstrated the depth of her commitment in ways that no words could have conveyed. Hedwig's response to the approaching crisis was characteristically direct and practical. Through their shared bond, she conveyed her readiness to support whatever choice Harry made, whether that meant fleeing to remote wilderness where they could live as wild creatures, fighting to protect their sanctuary against overwhelming odds, or facing the complex political challenges that confrontation with Dumbledore would entail. But beneath her practical support, Harry could sense Hedwig's own preferences and concerns. Her owl nature rebelled against the idea of permanent transformation that would subordinate his human consciousness to animal instincts, while her enhanced intelligence recognized the terrible risks involved in accelerated magical treatment. Like Harry himself, she was drawn toward the option that offered the greatest possibility for continued growth and development, even if it also carried the greatest immediate dangers. As the magical signatures of their pursuers approached the cottage's outermost defensive perimeters, Harry made his choice with the kind of intuitive certainty that his transformation had taught him to trust. He would not run from the confrontation that had been building since the night he first escaped from Privet Drive, nor would he sacrifice his human consciousness to avoid the challenges that lay ahead. Instead, he would face Dumbledore and his companions as what he had become, a being who transcended normal categories and could not be easily controlled or manipulated by those who thought they understood his nature and limitations. The decision brought with it a calm clarity that surprised Harry with its completeness. For months, he had been learning and growing and healing in preparation for challenges that he could only imagine in vague terms. Now, faced with the immediate reality of confronting the forces that had shaped his life from birth, he discovered that Professor Babbling's patient instruction and Hedwig's unwavering support had given him something that no amount of external protection could provide: confidence in his own judgment and capabilities. The cottage that had been his sanctuary was about to become a battleground, but Harry no longer felt like a helpless victim waiting to be rescued or recaptured. He was a young practitioner who had discovered his own power and was prepared to use it in defense of the freedom and autonomy that he had fought so hard to achieve. The approaching confrontation would test everything he had learned about magic, friendship, and the courage required to forge his own destiny in a world that demanded conformity to other people's expectations and plans. As Dumbledore's party reached the final approach to Professor Babbling's cottage, Harry transformed to his human form for the first time in weeks, standing beside Hedwig and Professor Babbling as an equal participant in whatever negotiations or conflicts lay ahead. The boy who had once been locked in a cupboard was preparing to face one of the most powerful wizards in the world as a free individual, capable of making his own choices about his future. The confrontation that would determine the course of his life was about to begin, and Harry was no longer afraid of the outcome. The thunderstorm that swept across the Scottish Highlands arrived without warning, as if the very elements themselves were responding to the magical tension that crackled through the air surrounding Professor Babbling's cottage. Lightning split the darkening sky in jagged patterns that seemed to mirror the complex ward structures protecting the sanctuary, while thunder rolled across the landscape with a force that made the ancient stone walls tremble with each concussion. Within this maelstrom of natural fury, 3 figures approached through the driving rain with the kind of methodical determination that no weather could deter. Albus Dumbledore's distinctive form was unmistakable even through the storm, his long robes whipping around him as he navigated the treacherous path that led to the cottage's front door. His companions moved with the practiced efficiency of aurors conducting official ministry business, their hands resting casually on their wands in a display of readiness that suggested they expected resistance rather than cooperation. The magical signatures that preceded their arrival painted the cottage's protective enchantments with waves of probing energy that tested every defensive layer Professor Babbling had constructed. Inside the cottage, Harry stood in his human form for the first time in weeks, his slight frame seeming almost fragile, after months of existing primarily as a creature designed for flight and freedom. But appearances were deceptive. The boy who faced the approaching confrontation carried himself with a poise and confidence that spoke of fundamental changes that went far beyond simple physical transformation. His green eyes held depths of understanding and determination that would have seemed impossible in someone so young, and his connection to Hedwig created an aura of shared power that made the very air around them shimmer with barely contained magical energy. Professor Babbling had spent the final minutes before Dumbledore's arrival conducting the most dangerous magical working of her entire career. The ritual she performed was designed to accelerate Harry's Horcrux treatment by months, compressing complex therapeutic processes into a single intensive session that would either free him completely from the soul fragment's influence or result in catastrophic magical backlash that could destroy them both. Her decision to attempt such desperate measures spoke to the absolute certainty that allowing Harry to fall back under Dumbledore's control would be a fate worse than any risk the accelerated treatment might pose. The magical circle that surrounded Harry pulsed with energies that drew from sources far older and more primal than conventional wizarding magic. Professor Babbling had reached back through centuries of magical tradition to find techniques that predated the Ministry's monitoring systems and regulatory frameworks, working with forces that operated according to natural law rather than political convenience. The spells she wove around Harry were simultaneously protective and transformative, designed to shield his developing magical core while forcing the foreign soul fragment toward a confrontation that would determine once and for all whether his magic would remain contaminated by Voldemort's influence. But the accelerated treatment process was far more traumatic than the gradual therapeutic approach Professor Babbling had originally planned. Harry's magical core was being subjected to pressures that would have challenged adult practitioners with decades of experience, and his ability to maintain consciousness through the ordeal was being tested in ways that pushed the limits of human endurance. Waves of pain and disorientation swept through him as his magic battled the soul fragment for control of his fundamental magical signature, each surge of conflict threatening to overwhelm his capacity for rational thought. Hedwig's presence beside him was the anchor that kept Harry from being lost entirely in the magical maelstrom that raged within his own consciousness. Through their enhanced familiar bond, she provided stability and clarity that allowed him to maintain his sense of self, even as forces beyond his comprehension tore at the very foundations of his magical identity. Her owl consciousness offered a different perspective on the conflict, one that saw the soul fragment not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as prey that could be isolated and eliminated through patience and precise action. The moment of Dumbledore's arrival coincided with the climax of Harry's magical treatment in ways that seemed too precisely timed to be coincidental. As the cottage's front door opened to admit the three figures from the storm, the Horcrux in Harry's scar began its final desperate struggle for survival, flooding his consciousness with memories and emotions that belonged to Tom Riddle rather than Harry Potter. The collision between external political pressure and internal magical crisis created a perfect storm of conflict that would determine not only Harry's immediate future, but the entire trajectory of his magical development. Dumbledore's entrance into the cottage carried the weight of authority and expectation that had shaped wizarding politics for decades. His presence filled the room with the kind of benevolent power that made resistance seem not only futile, but morally questionable, as if opposing his will was equivalent to rejecting wisdom and compassion themselves. But Harry's enhanced perception, sharpened by months of development beyond normal magical parameters, could detect the subtle manipulations and emotional influences that accompanied the old wizard's apparent concern and kindness. The conversation that began as Dumbledore approached the magical circle where Harry struggled with forces that threatened to tear his consciousness apart was marked by the kind of political sophistication that revealed decades of experience in managing complex situations through careful manipulation of information and emotional pressure. Dumbledore's words were chosen with surgical precision, designed to establish moral authority while simultaneously minimizing Harry's agency and autonomy in determining his own future. Professor Babbling's response to Dumbledore's presence demonstrated the courage and intellectual honesty that had made her one of the most respected researchers in her field. Rather than deferring to his reputation or allowing herself to be intimidated by the implicit threats that accompanied his official visit, she confronted him directly with evidence of the systematic manipulation and educational neglect that had characterized Harry's placement with the Dursleys. Her scholarly precision in presenting this evidence made it impossible for Dumbledore to dismiss her concerns as misunderstanding or emotional overreaction. The revelation of Professor Babbling's research into Harry's magical condition and the discoveries she had made about the Horcrux embedded in his scar created a moment of genuine surprise that broke through Dumbledore's carefully maintained composure. His reaction suggested someone who had been operating with incomplete information about the true nature of Harry's magical development, and whose long-term strategic planning might require fundamental revision in light of these new discoveries. But Dumbledore's surprise was accompanied by something that made Harry's enhanced senses recoil with instinctive wariness. Beneath the surface, concern and scholarly interest lay something calculating and acquisitive, as if the old wizard was already planning how to incorporate these new developments into whatever larger agenda had shaped his decisions about Harry's upbringing and education. The boy who had learned to read predatory intent in the behavior of forest creatures recognized similar patterns in Dumbledore's response to Professor Babbling's revelations. The magical treatment that Harry was undergoing reached its critical phase at the worst possible moment, just as Dumbledore began pressing for immediate custody and transportation to what he described as more secure facilities where proper care could be provided. The Horcrux fragment, sensing the approaching threat of complete removal, launched a desperate counterattack that flooded Harry's consciousness with visions and emotions designed to overwhelm his psychological defenses and establish permanent dominance over his magical development. The visions that assaulted Harry's mind were drawn from the darkest moments of Tom Riddle's transformation into Lord Voldemort, experiences of deliberate evil and casual cruelty that were intended to corrupt Harry's moral development and make him more susceptible to the soul fragment's influence. But the boy who experienced these horrific memories was not the isolated and vulnerable child that the Horcrux expected to find. Harry's months of healing and growth under Professor Babbling's guidance had given him psychological resources that allowed him to witness evil without being corrupted by it, to understand darkness without being consumed by it. More importantly, Hedwig's presence in his consciousness during this assault provided a form of protection that the soul fragment could neither understand nor counter. Her owl perspective on violence and death was fundamentally different from human moral complexity, accepting predatory behavior as natural while rejecting the deliberate cultivation of cruelty and suffering that characterized Voldemort's choices. Through their bond, Harry could process the Horcrux's memories without allowing them to define his understanding of power and its proper use. The confrontation between Harry's developing magical core and the parasitic soul fragment reached its climax just as Dumbledore made his move to take control of the situation. The old wizard's attempt to interrupt the magical treatment and transport Harry to facilities of his choosing triggered a resonance between the Horcrux and Harry's natural magic that created effects far beyond anything Professor Babbling had anticipated in her most pessimistic projections. Harry's partial transformation, which had become his most stable form during recent weeks, began to shift and change in response to the magical pressures that surrounded him from both internal and external sources. His human torso and arms remained intact, but his head took on increasingly pronounced owl characteristics, while his wings developed to full size and power. More dramatically, his magical abilities began manifesting in ways that bridged the gap between human spellwork and the natural magic that Hedwig used to achieve effects that formal wizarding education claimed were impossible. The sight of Harry in this hybrid form, wielding magical powers that defied conventional understanding, while engaged in what appeared to be life-or-death struggle with forces beyond normal comprehension, created a moment of shocked silence that allowed him to speak for the first time since the confrontation began. His voice carried harmonics that belonged to no purely human throat, and his words resonated with magical authority that made it impossible to dismiss him as simply a confused child in need of adult guidance and protection. Harry's declaration of independence was delivered with the kind of absolute certainty that comes from having faced the worst possible internal darkness and emerged with moral clarity intact. He rejected Dumbledore's claim to authority over his future, refused to accept placement in any facility that would restrict his autonomy or interrupt his healing, and made it clear that he was prepared to defend his choices through whatever means proved necessary. The boy who had once been powerless to influence even the smallest aspects of his daily existence was claiming the right to determine his own destiny, regardless of external political considerations. But Harry's defiance was not merely emotional rebellion against unwanted authority. His months of intensive magical education under Professor Babbling's guidance had given him theoretical knowledge and practical skills that allowed him to back up his declarations with genuine magical capability. The spells he began weaving around himself and Professor Babbling were sophisticated protective works that drew on multiple magical traditions while incorporating innovations that reflected his unique dual nature. Dumbledore's response to this unexpected development revealed aspects of his character that his public reputation had carefully concealed. The benevolent concern and patient wisdom that had marked his initial approach gave way to something harder and more calculating as he realized that his usual methods of persuasion and manipulation were proving ineffective against someone who had developed beyond the parameters of his strategic planning. The magical duel that erupted between Dumbledore and Harry was unprecedented in both its nature and its implications. This was not simply a contest between superior and inferior practitioners, but rather a clash between fundamentally different approaches to magic itself. Dumbledore's spellwork drew on decades of formal education and institutional authority, utilizing techniques that had been refined through centuries of academic tradition and political application. Harry's magic, by contrast, operated according to principles that bridged natural law and conscious intent, creating effects that formal wizarding education claimed were impossible or theoretical. The presence of the cottage's protective wards added another layer of complexity to the confrontation, as Professor Babbling's defensive spells began responding to the magical conflict in ways that reflected her own theoretical innovations and research discoveries. The ancient protections that surrounded the sanctuary were designed to repel conventional magical attacks, but they also amplified and redirected natural magical energies in patterns that favored practitioners who worked in harmony with, rather than in opposition, to the fundamental forces that governed magical reality. Hedwig's participation in the conflict was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire confrontation. Her enhanced intelligence and magical capabilities, developed through months of bonding with Harry, allowed her to coordinate their defensive efforts with precision that would have been impossible for any normal familiar. She served simultaneously as aerial reconnaissance, magical amplification, and tactical coordinator, creating a form of distributed magical consciousness that multiplied Harry's effective capabilities far beyond what his individual power level would normally allow. The turning point in the conflict came when Harry's accelerated Horcrux treatment reached its final phase simultaneously with Dumbledore's most aggressive attempt to overwhelm his defenses and establish magical dominance. The collision between these forces created a magical resonance that affected not only Harry, but every magical being within the cottage's protective boundaries, including Dumbledore himself. The Soul Fragment's final destruction was marked by a burst of dark energy that would have killed Harry if not for the protective protocols that Professor Babbling had woven into the treatment process. But the fragment's elimination also released Harry's natural magical development from constraints that had been limiting his growth since birth, triggering a surge of power that transformed his partial owl form into something that transcended normal species boundaries. For a crucial moment, Harry achieved the perfect integration between human consciousness and owl nature that represented the theoretical goal of his entire therapeutic process. His magical abilities stabilized at levels that would have challenged adult practitioners, while his psychological state achieved the kind of balanced clarity that allowed him to use power responsibly rather than simply wielding it for its own sake. The transformation that had begun as desperate escape from unbearable circumstances had become a deliberate choice to embrace possibilities that extended far beyond conventional magical development. Dumbledore's reaction to this transformation revealed the depth of his miscalculation about Harry's nature and potential. The old wizard had clearly expected to find a traumatized child in need of guidance and protection, someone who could be gradually shaped to serve whatever larger purposes his strategic planning required. Instead, he was confronted with a young practitioner who had achieved magical and psychological development that operated outside the frameworks that institutional magical education had established. The standoff that concluded the confrontation was marked by mutual recognition of changed circumstances that neither party had fully anticipated. Harry had proven his capability to defend his autonomy through magical means that Dumbledore could not easily counter or override, while Dumbledore had demonstrated that his concern for Harry's welfare was conditional on maintaining control over the boy's development and future choices. Professor Babbling's role in facilitating this resolution demonstrated the importance of having allies who understood both the theoretical principles and practical realities of magical development outside conventional institutional frameworks. Her willingness to sacrifice her own security and reputation for Harry's freedom had created the conditions that made his successful resistance to external control possible, while her scholarly expertise had provided the knowledge and techniques necessary for his healing and growth. As the storm outside began to subside and the immediate crisis passed into wary negotiation, Harry found himself in possession of something he had never experienced before: genuine independence backed by the power to maintain it. The boy who had once been locked in a cupboard had become someone capable of defending his right to determine his own future, while retaining the moral clarity and emotional connections that prevented such power from corrupting his fundamental character. The cottage that had been his sanctuary would no longer provide the same security it had offered during his healing process, but Harry no longer needed that level of protection. His transformation was complete in ways that went far beyond simple magical ability, encompassing the psychological resilience and practical skills necessary to navigate a world that would continue to challenge his right to exist outside conventional categories and expectations. The confrontation with Dumbledore had tested everything Harry had learned about courage, wisdom, and the proper use of power, and he had emerged from that test with confidence in his own judgment and capabilities that no external authority could undermine or destroy. The morning after the confrontation found Harry perched on the stone wall of Professor Babbling's garden, his form shifting fluidly between human and owl characteristics as he practiced the conscious control that had become second nature during the weeks following his liberation from the Horcrux. The destruction of Voldemort's soul fragment had not only freed him from external magical interference, but had also unleashed his natural magical development in ways that continued to surprise even Professor Babbling's extensive theoretical understanding. 3 days had passed since Dumbledore's reluctant departure from the cottage, 3 days of careful negotiation and strategic planning that had established new parameters for Harry's continued independence. The old wizard's final concession had been grudging but legally binding. Harry would remain under Professor Babbling's guardianship while continuing his unconventional magical education, but only under conditions of regular supervision and progress, reporting that satisfied ministry requirements for underage magical practitioners. The compromise was far from ideal, but it represented a victory that Harry had barely dared to hope for during the dark months of his initial transformation. He would be allowed to develop his unique dual nature without interference, to explore magical possibilities that conventional education never acknowledged, and to maintain the healing relationship with Hedwig that had become the foundation of his psychological stability and magical growth. But the agreement had also attracted attention from sources that posed different kinds of challenges than Dumbledore's paternalistic manipulation. Word of Harry's remarkable transformation and successful resistance to ministry authority had spread through networks of magical practitioners who operated outside conventional institutional frameworks, drawing interest from allies and potential enemies whose motivations remained unclear. This morning's visitor represented the first test of how Harry would navigate these new political complexities. The man approaching through the forest moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested extensive experience in dangerous terrain, but his magical signature carried none of the aggressive confidence that marked hostile intentions. His approach was open and deliberate, designed to avoid triggering defensive responses while clearly announcing his presence to anyone with the skills to detect magical surveillance. Professor Babbling had been expecting this visit ever since her emergency communications with certain colleagues had revealed the true scope of Harry's situation and the remarkable nature of his magical development. The network of researchers and practitioners who shared her commitment to advancing magical understanding beyond institutional limitations had been following Harry's progress with intense interest, and several had expressed willingness to provide support and resources that could prove crucial in the challenges ahead. Remus Lupin's arrival at the cottage marked the beginning of a new phase in Harry's education and development, one that would connect him to his parents' legacy in ways that went far beyond simple emotional comfort. Professor Babbling's correspondence with the werewolf had revealed his extensive knowledge of both theoretical magic and practical survival skills, his personal connection to James and Lily Potter, and his growing disillusionment with Dumbledore's secretive approach to managing threats against the magical community. More importantly, Remus possessed information about Harry's family history and magical heritage that Dumbledore had systematically concealed or misrepresented throughout Harry's childhood. His willingness to share this knowledge represented not only emotional healing for Harry, but also practical advantages that could prove decisive in future confrontations with those who sought to control or manipulate his development. The reunion between Harry and his father's best friend was marked by emotions that transcended simple family connection. Remus's shock at seeing Harry in his hybrid form was quickly replaced by recognition and acceptance that spoke to his own experience as someone whose nature defied conventional categories. His transformation during full moons had given him insights into the challenges of maintaining human consciousness within animal instincts, creating a foundation for understanding that no purely human advisor could provide. But Remus brought more than emotional support and theoretical knowledge to Harry's sanctuary. His years of experience in magical resistance movements had taught him practical skills in avoiding detection, establishing secure communications, and organizing resources for extended conflicts against superior forces. His presence represented the beginning of Harry's education in the political and strategic realities that would shape his adult life as someone who existed outside normal magical society. The intelligence that Remus shared about Dumbledore's broader strategic planning revealed disturbing patterns that went far beyond Harry's individual situation. The old wizard's manipulation of events and people extended throughout the magical community, creating a network of dependencies and obligations that allowed him to exert influence far beyond his official positions and authorities. Harry's successful resistance had disrupted carefully laid plans that involved multiple other magical practitioners, potentially creating opportunities for systemic change that extended well beyond his personal freedom. More immediately threatening was Remus's information about other parties who had taken interest in Harry's unique magical development. The Ministry's official investigation had been only one of several inquiries that were being conducted by groups with very different agendas and capabilities. Some sought to exploit Harry's unusual abilities for their own purposes, while others viewed his existence as a threat to magical stability that required elimination rather than control. Professor Babbling's response to these revelations demonstrated the thoroughness with which she had prepared for the political complexities that would follow Harry's emergence as an independent magical practitioner. Her research network included contacts throughout the international magical community, people who could provide sanctuary, resources, and strategic guidance if circumstances made continued residence in Britain impossible or inadvisable. But the most significant aspect of Remus's visit was his information about Sirius Black and the true circumstances of his imprisonment. The story that emerged from his careful explanation challenged fundamental assumptions about the events surrounding Harry's parents' death and revealed layers of betrayal and manipulation that made Dumbledore's paternalistic control seem almost benevolent by comparison. The revelation that Sirius was Harry's godfather and had been falsely imprisoned for crimes he had not committed added personal urgency to political considerations about justice and accountability within the magical legal system. But more importantly, it offered Harry the possibility of family connection that was both legally recognized and emotionally genuine, a relationship that could provide the kind of unconditional support and advocacy that his unique situation required. Remus's plan to prove Sirius's innocence and secure his release required careful coordination and considerable risk, but it also offered opportunities for Harry to develop practical skills in investigation, evidence gathering, and legal advocacy that would serve him well in future challenges. The project would be his first opportunity to use his magical abilities in service of goals that extended beyond personal survival and development. The magical techniques that Remus began teaching Harry represented a synthesis of formal wizarding education and practical survival skills that reflected his own unconventional background and experience. His approach emphasized adaptability and creative problem-solving rather than rote memorization of established spells and procedures, encouraging Harry to develop magical techniques that took advantage of his unique dual nature rather than trying to force him into conventional categories. More importantly, Remus's instruction included lessons in magical ethics and responsibility that addressed the moral complexities of wielding power outside normal legal and social frameworks. His own experience with lycanthropy had taught him that those who existed on the margins of magical society faced choices and temptations that conventional education never acknowledged, and he was determined to help Harry develop the moral foundations necessary to use his abilities responsibly. The training sessions that began immediately upon Remus's arrival pushed Harry's magical development in directions that Professor Babbling's purely theoretical approach had never explored. Combat magic, stealth techniques, and emergency medical procedures were subjects that academic study could introduce, but that required practical application under controlled conditions before they became reliable capabilities. Harry's dual nature provided advantages in this practical training that would have been impossible for conventional students to achieve. His owl consciousness contributed predatory focus and spatial awareness that enhanced his combat reflexes, while his human reasoning allowed him to develop tactical approaches that utilized these enhanced capabilities strategically rather than simply reactively. But perhaps the most valuable aspect of Remus's instruction was his willingness to acknowledge and address the emotional challenges that accompanied Harry's rapid development and increasing isolation from normal magical society. His own experience as an outsider had taught him that power without community could become corrupted by loneliness and resentment, and he was determined to help Harry maintain the human connections that would prevent such deterioration. The bond between Harry and Hedwig continued to evolve throughout these intensive training sessions, developing into something that transcended normal familiar relationships while remaining grounded in genuine affection and mutual respect. Hedwig's participation in magical exercises revealed capabilities that amazed even Remus's extensive experience with unusual magical phenomena, suggesting that their partnership represented genuinely new possibilities for magical practice and development. More significantly, Hedwig's presence provided emotional stability that allowed Harry to push the limits of his magical development without losing sight of his fundamental values and priorities. Her owl perspective on violence and survival offered moral clarity that complemented rather than conflicted with human ethical considerations, creating a form of integrated consciousness that was both powerful and responsible. The investigation into Sirius Black's case began with magical research techniques that combined Professor Babbling's scholarly methods with Remus's practical experience in gathering intelligence under dangerous conditions. The evidence that emerged from their careful work painted a picture of systematic corruption and cover-up within the Ministry's legal system that extended far beyond Sirius's individual case. More disturbing still was the discovery that Peter Pettigrew, the true betrayer of Harry's parents, had been living in magical concealment for years while allowing an innocent man to suffer imprisonment for his crimes. The revelation that Pettigrew was still alive and accessible raised the possibility of definitive proof that could not only free Sirius, but expose the corruption that had made his false imprisonment possible. Harry's role in gathering this evidence required him to develop skills in magical surveillance and investigation that pushed his abilities in new directions while providing practical experience in the kind of complex magical work that would characterize his adult practice. His dual nature offered unique advantages in covert observation, as his owl form could access locations and gather information that would be impossible for human investigators to obtain safely. But the investigation also revealed the extent to which Dumbledore had been aware of Sirius's innocence while choosing to allow his continued imprisonment for strategic reasons that prioritized larger political considerations over individual justice. The pattern of manipulation and sacrifice of personal welfare for supposed greater good was becoming increasingly clear as Harry and his allies uncovered more evidence about the events that had shaped his early life. The magical detection of Peter Pettigrew's current location required coordination between Harry's enhanced senses, Remus's tracking expertise, and Professor Babbling's theoretical knowledge of concealment magic. The process took weeks of careful work, but eventually yielded results that offered genuine hope for Sirius's exoneration and release. More importantly, the investigation had given Harry practical experience in magical collaboration and project management that would prove crucial in future endeavors. His ability to coordinate complex magical workings with multiple participants while maintaining security and avoiding detection represented skills that conventional magical education never addressed, but that were essential for anyone operating outside institutional frameworks. The plan that emerged from their careful research was ambitious but achievable, requiring precise timing and considerable courage, but offering real possibilities for success. They would expose Peter Pettigrew publicly while presenting evidence of his crimes in ways that made denial or cover-up impossible, creating conditions where Sirius's release would become politically necessary rather than simply morally justified. But the plan also required Harry to accept levels of public exposure and scrutiny that would end his anonymity and make him a target for everyone who had political or personal reasons to control or eliminate him. His choice to proceed despite these risks represented a conscious decision to embrace the responsibilities that came with his power, rather than using his abilities purely for personal benefit and protection. The magical preparations for confronting Pettigrew required Harry to master combat techniques that he had only begun learning under Remus's instruction. His hybrid form provided natural advantages in magical combat, but utilizing those advantages effectively required training and practice that pushed his abilities to their current limits while preparing him for challenges that would only grow more complex and dangerous. Hedwig's role in these preparations revealed new aspects of their bond that amazed their allies and teachers. Her ability to coordinate with Harry during complex magical operations had evolved to the point where they functioned as a single magical entity with distributed consciousness and capabilities, creating possibilities for magical practice that had no precedent in recorded magical history. The emotional preparation for what lay ahead was perhaps more challenging than the magical training, as Harry confronted the reality that his childhood was effectively over, and that his future would be defined by challenges and responsibilities that most adults would find overwhelming. His transformation from powerless victim to capable practitioner had been remarkably rapid, but it had also required him to abandon any possibility of normal development or conventional life experiences. But Harry's allies recognized that his unique situation also offered opportunities for positive change that extended far beyond his personal liberation. His successful resistance to institutional control and manipulation had created precedents and possibilities that could benefit other magical practitioners who had been marginalized or exploited by existing power structures. As the final preparations for confronting Peter Pettigrew neared completion, Harry found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought him from a locked cupboard to a position where he could influence the course of magical politics and social justice. The boy who had once been powerless to defend himself against his uncle's rage had become someone capable of challenging systemic corruption and fighting for the rights of others who had been victimized by those same systems. The cottage that had been his sanctuary was about to become a base of operations for activities that would have significant political and social consequences, but Harry no longer felt daunted by the scope of what lay ahead. His months of intensive development had given him not only magical capabilities, but also the confidence and moral clarity necessary to use those capabilities responsibly in service of causes that extended beyond personal interest. The alliance between Harry, Professor Babbling, and Remus represented something new in magical politics, a partnership between principled practitioners who shared commitment to justice and individual autonomy rather than institutional power and political advantage. Their collaboration offered hope for systemic change that could address the underlying problems that had made Harry's suffering possible while preventing similar injustices from occurring in the future. The approaching confrontation with Peter Pettigrew would test everything Harry had learned about courage, strategy, and the proper use of power, but he was no longer facing these challenges alone or without guidance. The allies who had chosen to support his independence and development shared his commitment to principles that transcended personal interest, creating a foundation for resistance that could withstand the pressures and temptations that would inevitably accompany their growing influence and capabilities. The abandoned warehouse in the industrial district of Birmingham had not seen legitimate use for decades, its broken windows and rusted machinery providing perfect camouflage for the kind of clandestine activities that required absolute secrecy and complete deniability. Within its crumbling walls, 3 figures moved with the careful precision of hunters who had finally cornered their long-sought prey, each step calculated to avoid the squeaking floorboards and scattered debris that might betray their presence to the creature they had spent weeks tracking to this desolate location. Harry's enhanced senses, sharpened by months of development beyond normal magical parameters, could detect every subtle vibration and minute sound that echoed through the cavernous space. His dual nature provided advantages that conventional aura training could never duplicate, allowing him to perceive magical signatures and emotional states with the kind of clarity that made concealment nearly impossible for anyone operating within his range of detection. 6 weeks had passed since Remus Lupin's arrival at Professor Babbling's cottage. 6 weeks of intensive investigation and magical preparation that had finally yielded the breakthrough they needed to prove Sirius Black's innocence and expose the corruption that had made his false imprisonment possible. The trail of evidence had led them through layers of ministry bureaucracy and dark wizard networks, revealing connections and conspiracies that extended far beyond the simple question of one man's guilt or innocence. Peter Pettigrew's hiding place represented the culmination of investigative work that had pushed Harry's magical abilities in directions that conventional education never acknowledged. Tracking a wizard who had mastered both animagus transformation and advanced concealment magic required techniques that bridged the gap between human spellwork and the natural magic that allowed creatures like Hedwig to navigate complex magical environments through instinct and enhanced perception. The magical signatures that had led them to this abandoned warehouse were faint and carefully masked, but Harry's unique perspective allowed him to detect patterns that even Remus's extensive experience might have missed. The combination of his owl consciousness and human reasoning created a form of analytical capability that could unravel deceptions designed to fool purely human or purely animal detection methods. But finding Peter Pettigrew was only the beginning of their mission. Capturing him alive and extracting a confession that would satisfy legal requirements while exposing the broader network of corruption that had enabled his crimes required planning and execution that left no room for error or hesitation. The stakes extended far beyond Sirius's individual freedom to encompass questions of justice and accountability that would influence the magical community's political future. Professor Babbling's role in this operation demonstrated the remarkable evolution of her character from pure academic researcher to active participant in magical resistance activities. Her theoretical knowledge of concealment magic and interrogation techniques had proven invaluable in planning their approach, while her scholarly network had provided resources and intelligence that conventional law enforcement could never access. More importantly, her presence served as both magical support and moral anchor for Harry as he prepared to confront directly the man whose betrayal had destroyed his family and shaped the traumatic circumstances of his early childhood. The emotional challenges of facing Peter Pettigrew were potentially more dangerous than any magical obstacles they might encounter, and Professor Babbling's steady guidance would be crucial in helping Harry maintain psychological stability throughout the confrontation. Hedwig's participation in this mission represented perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their entire operation. Her magical development had progressed to the point where she could serve simultaneously as aerial reconnaissance, magical amplification, and tactical coordinator, creating a form of distributed consciousness that multiplied their effective capabilities far beyond what their individual power levels would normally allow. But more than simple tactical advantage, Hedwig's presence provided emotional support that allowed Harry to maintain his fundamental values and priorities, even while engaging in activities that required him to embrace aspects of his nature that resembled the predatory behavior he had witnessed in Voldemort's memories. Her owl perspective on hunting and survival offered moral clarity that prevented necessary violence from becoming corrupted by anger or revenge. The magical surveillance network that they had established around the warehouse revealed details about Peter Pettigrew's current activities that painted a disturbing picture of a man whose years of hiding had been marked by increasingly desperate attempts to curry favor with dark wizards and criminal organizations. His transformation from cowardly betrayer to active participant in magical crimes suggested a deterioration of character that made him both more dangerous and more vulnerable than they had initially anticipated. Remus's intelligence about Peter's psychological state had proven crucial in developing their approach to capturing and interrogating him. The man who had once been his friend had become something twisted by guilt and fear into a creature that bore little resemblance to the person he had known during their school years at Hogwarts. Understanding this psychological deterioration would be essential to breaking through the layers of self-deception and rationalization that Peter had constructed to justify his crimes. The magical techniques that Harry had developed for this specific mission represented a synthesis of everything he had learned about stealth, combat, and investigation during his months of intensive training. His dual nature provided unique advantages in each of these areas, but utilizing those advantages effectively required precise control and strategic thinking that pushed his abilities to their current limits. His approach to the warehouse combined owl stealth with human planning, allowing him to navigate the building's interior while avoiding detection by both magical and mundane security measures. The concealment spells that Peter had woven around his hideout were sophisticated, but designed to fool purely human senses, creating blind spots that Harry's enhanced perception could exploit to gain crucial tactical advantages. The moment of direct confrontation arrived with the sudden intensity that characterized all predator-prey encounters, as Harry's careful approach finally brought him within range of Peter Pettigrew's hiding place. The man huddled in a makeshift shelter, constructed from debris and magical protection, was barely recognizable as the person whose school photographs Remus had shown Harry during their planning sessions. Years of living in constant fear and magical concealment had taken their toll on Peter's physical appearance and mental stability. His transformation into rat form had apparently become so habitual that even in human shape he retained mannerisms and reflexes that belonged more to his animal nature than to normal human behavior. The sight was both pathetic and repulsive, inspiring pity and revulsion in equal measure. But Harry's enhanced perception could detect aspects of Peter's condition that pure visual observation would never reveal. The magical signatures surrounding the man indicated complex enchantments designed to prevent detection and enhance survival, but they also showed signs of magical exhaustion and psychological strain that suggested someone operating at the very limits of his capabilities. More significantly, Harry could sense the emotional states that Peter was struggling to conceal beneath layers of magical protection and psychological defense. The guilt and fear that drove his desperate behavior were so intense that they created distortions in his magical aura that made him appear far more powerful and dangerous than he actually was. The capture itself was accomplished with efficiency that surprised even Harry's allies with its clinical precision. The combination of stealth, speed, and overwhelming magical superiority eliminated any possibility of escape or resistance before Peter had fully comprehended that his hiding place had been discovered. Months of training and preparation culminated in moments of perfectly executed action that left their target secured without significant risk to themselves. But the interrogation that followed proved far more challenging than the capture had been. Peter's psychological state was so fragmented by years of guilt and fear that extracting coherent information required techniques that combined magical compulsion with psychological manipulation in ways that pushed the boundaries of ethical behavior. Professor Babling's expertise in both magical theory and human psychology proved invaluable in navigating these ethical challenges while still obtaining the evidence they needed to prove Sirius's innocence. Her approach balanced the necessity of extracting truthful testimony with respect for human dignity and legal requirements that would make their evidence admissible in formal proceedings. The confession that emerged from this careful interrogation revealed layers of corruption and conspiracy that extended far beyond the simple question of who had betrayed Harry's parents to Voldemort. Peter's testimony painted a picture of systematic manipulation and cover-up that involved multiple ministry officials and dark wizard networks working in coordination to achieve political goals that sacrificed individual justice for supposed strategic advantage. More disturbing still was the revelation that Dumbledore had known of Peter's survival and continued freedom while choosing to allow Sirius to remain imprisoned for crimes he had not committed. The pattern of manipulation and sacrifice of personal welfare for supposed greater good was becoming increasingly clear as more evidence emerged about the events that had shaped Harry's early life and the broader magical community's political development. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Peter's confession was his testimony about the specific magical techniques that had been used to frame Sirius for crimes he had not committed. The evidence that emerged from this interrogation not only proved Sirius's innocence, but also revealed methods and procedures that could be used to identify and expose similar injustices throughout the magical legal system. Harry's role in extracting this confession required him to confront directly the emotional and psychological challenges of facing his parents' betrayer while maintaining the moral clarity necessary to treat even enemies with basic human dignity. The temptation to allow anger and desire for revenge to influence his actions was intense, but his months of healing and development had given him the psychological resources necessary to resist such corrupting influences. More importantly, Hedwig's presence throughout the interrogation provided perspective and emotional support that prevented Harry from losing sight of his fundamental values and priorities. Her owl consciousness offered clarity about the difference between necessary predatory behavior and unnecessary cruelty, helping him maintain the balance between effectiveness and ethics that responsible use of power required. The magical evidence gathering that accompanied Peter's confession involved techniques that combined Professor Babbling's scholarly expertise with Harry's unique perceptual abilities and Remus's practical experience in documentation and verification procedures. The result was a comprehensive record that would satisfy both legal requirements and political necessities for exposing the corruption that had made Sirius's false imprisonment possible. But creating admissible evidence was only one aspect of their larger mission to achieve justice and systematic reform. The information they had gathered revealed patterns of corruption and abuse that extended throughout multiple areas of magical government and society, creating opportunities for broader changes that could benefit many people who had been victimized by existing power structures. The plan for revealing their evidence publicly required careful coordination with allies throughout the magical community who shared their commitment to justice and reform, but who operated within different spheres of influence and authority. Media contacts, legal advocates, and political reformers would need to be coordinated to ensure that Peter's confession received the attention and serious consideration that its implications demanded. Harry's growing reputation as someone who had successfully resisted institutional manipulation and achieved remarkable magical development outside conventional frameworks had created opportunities for building coalitions that might not have been possible for more traditional reformers to achieve. His unique perspective and demonstrated capabilities gave him credibility with constituencies that conventional political figures could never reach. But public exposure would also mean accepting levels of scrutiny and potential hostility that would end any possibility of returning to the anonymous sanctuary that had characterized his months of healing and development. His choice to proceed despite these risks represented a conscious decision to embrace the responsibilities that came with his power and influence, rather than using his abilities purely for personal benefit and protection. The magical preparations for public revelation required coordination between multiple parties with different capabilities and areas of expertise, creating challenges that tested Harry's developing skills in leadership and strategic planning. His ability to maintain focus on long-term goals while managing complex immediate logistics represented growth that went far beyond simple magical ability to encompass the practical skills necessary for effective political action. More significantly, the mission had demonstrated the effectiveness of their unconventional partnership and the advantages that could be achieved by combining different types of expertise and perspective in pursuit of shared goals. The collaboration between Harry's unique magical abilities, Professor Babbling's scholarly knowledge, and Remus's practical experience had produced results that none of them could have achieved working independently. The emotional significance of their success extended far beyond the immediate question of Sirius's freedom to encompass broader themes of justice, accountability, and the possibility of positive change within systems that had seemed hopelessly corrupted by entrenched interests and institutional inertia. Their work had proven that principled resistance could achieve concrete results when supported by careful planning and effective execution. As they prepared to leave the warehouse with their captured prize and invaluable evidence, Harry reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him from powerless victim to active agent of justice and reform. The boy who had once been locked in a cupboard had become someone capable of challenging systemic corruption and fighting effectively for the rights of others who had been victimized by those same systems. But perhaps most importantly, the mission had demonstrated that his unique magical development and dual nature were not burdens to be managed or obstacles to be overcome, but rather advantages that allowed him to achieve things that would have been impossible for conventional practitioners to accomplish. His transformation from human child to something more complex and capable had given him tools for positive change that extended far beyond personal survival and protection. The warehouse that had been Peter Pettigrew's hiding place would soon be empty again, but the evidence and confessions that had been extracted from its shadows would reshape the magical community's understanding of justice, accountability, and the possibility of reform. The mission that had begun with the simple goal of proving one man's innocence had evolved into something that could influence the political and social development of magical Britain for generations to come. The approaching revelation of their discoveries would test everything Harry had learned about courage, strategy, and the proper use of power. But he was no longer facing these challenges alone or without resources. The allies who had chosen to support his development and independence shared his commitment to principles that transcended personal interest, creating a foundation for continued resistance and reform that could withstand the pressures and temptations that would inevitably accompany their growing influence and capabilities. As they departed the warehouse with Peter Pettigrew secured and his confession documented, Harry understood that his transformation was entering a new phase that would require different skills and face different challenges than those that had characterized his journey from powerless child to capable practitioner. The boy who had learned to survive was about to discover what it meant to truly live as someone who could influence the world around him for the better.